Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The summer heat in Florida was unforgiving in July 2017. I remember it vividly. The way my t-shirt clung to my back as Michael, Jason and I hauled our gear from the dusty parking lot of the county park toward our favorite camping spot along the Alafia River. We had been documenting our outdoor adventures on our small YouTube channel for nearly 2 years by then, but this particular location held a special significance for us. How much farther? Jason asked, adjusting the straps of his overstuffed backpack. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto his wire-rimmed glasses. Just past the bend, I replied, swatting at a mosquito on my arm. Another quarter-mile tops. The path grew narrower as we ventured deeper into the thicket, leaving behind the manicured trails of the county park. Few tourists ventured this far downriver, which was precisely why we cherished it. The area had remained relatively untouched back then, a stark contrast to its current state, overrun with weekend warriors and influencers seeking the perfect backdrop for their social media posts. The afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. The familiar scent of damp earth and river water filled my nostrils as we approached our destination. The bend in the river created a natural clearing, the embankment rising about 12 feet above the water. Below, a small trail hugged the riverbank, offering stunning views of the waterway. Should we set up on top of the embankment like usual? Michael asked, already shrugging off his pack. I surveyed the area, wiping sweat from my brow. Something about the river called to me that day. Let's try something different. How about camping directly on the river trail? The view is better down there. Jason looked uncertain. Isn't that a bit close to the water? What if it rains? Weather forecast said clear skies, I assured him. Plus, we can hear the water better. Make for some good ambient sound in the video. Little did I know that decision would forever change how I viewed the darkness that falls over Florida's wilderness. The descent down the embankment required careful navigation. The slope wasn't particularly steep, but years of rainfall had carved narrow channels into the dirt, creating treacherous footing. We formed a human chain, passing our equipment down to ensure nothing tumbled into the river. My tent went up first, positioned at the base of the trail where it leveled off and turned to follow the riverbank. Michael and Jason shared a larger tent, which they erected about 15 feet away, closer to the water's edge. By mid-afternoon, our campsite had taken shape. I'm going to gather some firewood, I announced, unsheathing my machete. We'll need plenty for tonight. I'll set up the cooking gear, Michael volunteered. Jason nodded. I'll filter some water and scout around a bit. The forest surrounding our campsite was dense but navigable. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss stood like ancient sentinels among younger pines and palmettos. The undergrowth was thick in places, mostly saw palmetto and various ferns that thrived in the humid climate. As I collected deadfall for our fire, I noticed how the woods grew quieter the farther I ventured from camp. Not completely silent, bird calls still echoed through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals disturbed the underbrush, but there was a stillness that felt unnatural. I attributed it to the midday heat. Most wildlife would become more active once temperatures dropped. I returned to camp with an armful of branches. Found some perfect pieces, I called out. We'll need to break down some of the larger ones. Michael looked up from assembling the portable stove. There's a big oak near the camp. We can break them against the trunk. The method was crude but effective. We'd swing larger branches against the sturdy oak, snapping them into manageable pieces for the fire. The sharp crack of wood splitting echoed across the river, momentarily silencing the chorus of frogs and birds. I had no way of knowing this sound would return to haunt me later that night. As the sun began its descent, we finished securing our campsite. Food items hung from a tree branch to deter wildlife. Tents were double-checked for stability, and our fire pit was lined with river rocks. The day's heat gradually gave way to the more forgiving temperature of evening, though humidity remained high. Our camp stove hissed as Jason prepared a simple meal of dehydrated camping food rehydrated with filtered river water. Not gourmet by any standard, but after a day of hiking and setting up camp, it tasted magnificent. "Remember to get some good footage for the channel," Michael reminded us, gesturing to the camera mounted on a small tripod nearby. "Subscribers love sunset shots over the river." We ate as dusk settled over the landscape. The river reflected the darkening sky, its surface occasionally disturbed by jumping fish. Fireflies began to emerge, their gentle yellow-green glow punctuating the growing shadows. After dinner, we sat around the freshly built fire. Flames licked at the darkness, casting our faces in an orange glow. This was my favorite part of camping: the casual conversation, the camaraderie, the temporary escape from everyday concerns. "You know what lives in these woods, right?" Jason said with a mischievous grin, his face half hidden in shadow. Michael groaned. "Here we go again with the skunk ape stories." "Hey, there have been sightings in this area," Jason protested. "Just last year, a kayaker reported seeing something large moving through the trees not far from here." "Florida's version of Bigfoot," I explained, stoking the fire with a stick. "Supposedly smaller and with a distinct odor, hence the name." "Locals have reported encounters for decades," Jason continued eagerly. "They say it's between 6 and 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair. Some think it's just a bear standing on its hind legs, but others swear it's something else entirely." Michael remained skeptical. "There's always some explanation. Misidentified animals, tricks of light, overactive imaginations fueled by too many beers." "What about the tree knocking?" Jason pressed. "That's a common report with skunk ape sightings. They supposedly communicate by hitting trees with sticks or branches." I laughed. "You mean exactly like we were doing earlier to break firewood?" The conversation continued in this vein as night fully descended. Our headlamps created cones of light in the darkness as we prepared for bed. The woods had come alive with nocturnal sounds, a symphony of insects, frogs, and the occasional bird call. In the distance, we could hear the yipping of coyotes. None of us could have predicted how quickly that natural chorus would be silenced. By 10 p.m., we had extinguished the fire and retreated to our respective tents. The night had grown considerably darker, with clouds obscuring the stars and moon. Inside my small dome tent, I arranged my sleeping bag and positioned my flashlight and machete within easy reach, a habit from years of wilderness camping. I've always struggled with sleeping outdoors unless I'm the first to drift off. Something about hearing others fall asleep while I remain awake triggers a vigilance in me that's difficult to overcome. That night was no exception. From the other tent, Michael's soft snores soon mingled with the ambient sounds of the river. Jason occasionally shifted position, his sleeping bag rustling before he too succumbed to exhaustion. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling of my tent. Despite the relative discomfort of the ground beneath me, I wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, I was in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, where thoughts drift aimlessly and time loses meaning. The natural sounds of the Florida night created a soothing backdrop: the constant chorus of frogs and toads by the riverbank, the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the underbrush, the occasional splash as a fish broke the river's surface, all merged into a natural white noise that usually helped lull me toward sleep. I must have drifted in and out of consciousness for several hours. The glowing display of my watch read 2:17 a.m. when I became aware that something had changed. My eyes snapped open, suddenly alert, though I couldn't immediately identify what had triggered my awareness. Then it hit me. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The endless symphony of nighttime creatures had ceased entirely. Not gradually, as might happen when a predator prowls nearby, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The only sound that remained was the gentle trickle of the river water flowing past our campsite. I sat up slowly, heart beginning to accelerate. Anyone who spends time in wilderness areas knows that sudden silence typically signals danger. Prey animals don't fall quiet without cause. Straining my ears, I tried to detect any sound beyond the river's flow. For several long moments, nothing disturbed the unnatural quiet. Then, faintly at first but growing clearer, I heard it: the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the embankment above our campsite. The footsteps moved with deliberate slowness across the embankment. Not the frantic scurrying of a raccoon or the armored waddle of an armadillo, both common in these parts. but the measured pace of something large moving on two legs. My first thought was that another hiker had somehow found our remote location, though wandering through dense Florida woods in the middle of the night without a visible light source seemed implausible. My second thought was that perhaps Michael or Jason had left their tent, though a quick straining of my ears confirmed continued snoring from their direction. The footfalls continued their measured progression along the top of the embankment directly above my tent. Each step was deliberate, heavy enough that I could feel subtle vibrations through the ground beneath me. Whatever was up there was substantial in size. I reached for my flashlight and machete, placing both across my lap as I sat cross-legged in my sleeping bag. Part of me wanted to call out to my friends to wake them, but something primitive in my brain warned against revealing my consciousness to whatever stalked above. The footsteps reached the top of the trail that led down to our campsite and stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the footsteps themselves. I knew somehow that it was looking down at our tents, considering its next move. I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on me. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I waited, muscles tense, breath shallow. Then it happened, a sound so unexpected and deliberate that it sent electric fear racing through my body. Crack. The unmistakable sound of wood striking wood echoed through the night. A branch or stick being deliberately struck against a tree trunk. Exactly like we had been doing earlier to break firewood, but heavier, more purposeful. Crack. Crack, 2 more strikes, closer this time. The sound wasn't random or accidental. It carried a deliberate quality, almost like communication. I recalled Jason's words from earlier about tree knocking being associated with skunk ape sightings, but quickly pushed the thought aside. This was real, not some campfire tale. Then the footsteps resumed, this time descending the trail toward our tents. Each footfall on the downward trail sent subtle vibrations through the ground. I could feel them through the seat of my pants, rhythmic pulses that grew stronger as whatever it was approached. The weight behind those steps suggested something far heavier than a human. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps reached the bottom of the trail, mere feet from where my tent stood. They paused there, and in the absolute silence I detected something else, breathing. Slow, controlled breathing, just outside the thin fabric wall that separated me from the night. The rainfly of my tent obscured any possibility of seeing outside, but somehow I knew it was standing right beside me, separated only by millimeters of synthetic material. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, not just seen but studied with predatory intensity. Primal fear flooded my system. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to burst from the tent and run without looking back. My hands gripped the machete handle so tightly that my knuckles ached. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. The breathing outside grew slightly louder, a ragged inhale followed by a measured exhale. It was smelling me, I realized with growing horror, testing my scent through the fabric of the tent. For what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, we remained in this terrible standoff. Me frozen inside, it waiting outside. I considered my options. Stay perfectly still and hope it lost interest. Call out to my friends to increase our numbers, or use my flashlight to potentially scare it away. Before I could act on any of these thoughts, the presence moved. The footsteps resumed, this time moving past my tent toward where Michael and Jason slept. The oppressive weight of its attention lifted from me, allowing me to draw a shaking breath. With trembling hands, I carefully unzipped the top corner of my tent just enough to position my flashlight. The motion seemed to take forever, each millimeter of the zipper potentially alerting the thing to my actions. Finally creating a gap large enough, I thrust the flashlight through and clicked it on. The powerful LED beam cut through the darkness like a laser, illuminating the trail toward my friend's tent. I swept it back and forth rapidly, expecting to catch sight of whatever had just passed by. Nothing. The trail was empty, yet I had heard it move in that direction just seconds before. There was no way it could have moved out of sight so quickly, not without making noise. The trees and underbrush were too dense for silent passage. I kept the light trained on the area between our tents for several long minutes, machete gripped in my other hand. Eventually, almost imperceptibly at first, the natural sounds of the night began to return. A lone cricket chirped tentatively, then another joined. A bullfrog croaked from the riverbank. Gradually, the normal nocturnal symphony resumed. Whatever had visited us had departed, or at least, moved beyond detection. I remained awake for the rest of the night, flashlight and machete at the ready. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf outside sent fresh waves of adrenaline through my system. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness until the first gray light of dawn finally penetrated the darkness. At approximately 5:30 a.m., I heard the zipper of the other tent slide open. Peering through my own tent opening, I saw Michael emerge, bleary-eyed and yawning. He stumbled toward the tree line, clearly heading to relieve himself after a full night's sleep. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool morning air, my body stiff from hours of tense vigilance. "Hey," I called softly, not wanting to wake Jason yet. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" Michael turned, surprised to see me up so early. "Like what? Footsteps? Something walking around the campsite?" He scratched his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "Yeah, actually. Heard something moving around outside. Figured it was you trying to freak us out." "It wasn't me," I said flatly. "I was in my tent all night." Michael shrugged. "Probably just wildlife then. Raccoon or something." "It wasn't a raccoon," I insisted. This was heavy. Walking on two legs. And there was that tree knocking sound. His expression shifted from sleepy indifference to mild concern. "Tree knocking? Like in those skunk ape stories Jason was telling?" "I don't know what it was," I admitted. "But it was right outside my tent. I could hear it breathing." Michael's eyes widened slightly, but skepticism quickly returned. "Man, those ghost stories really got to you, huh? Look, let's check around the campsite. If something big was here, it would have left traces." While Michael finished his morning ritual, I began examining the area around our tents. The soft ground should have captured footprints of anything substantial that passed through. The morning light, still diffused through the tree canopy, made detailed observation challenging, but I persisted. After 20 minutes of careful searching, I had found nothing conclusive. No definitive footprints, no broken branches at human height, no tufts of hair caught on brush, nothing to validate my experience. By the time Jason emerged from the tent, Michael had started preparing breakfast on our camp stove. I approached them both, determined to convey the gravity of what had happened. "There was something here last night," I stated firmly. It walked down from the embankment, stood right next to my tent, then moved toward yours. It made deliberate knocking sounds against the trees. Jason's expression immediately reflected interest, while Michael remained skeptical. "We heard movement," Jason confirmed. "But like Mike said, we thought it was you." "Did you smell anything unusual?" Jason asked, immediately thinking of the skunk ape's reputed odor. I shook my head. "No, nothing like that." "Could have been a person," Michael suggested, flipping a pancake on the small griddle. "Maybe someone from another campsite exploring at night." "Without a light? And who leaves without making any sound when a flashlight suddenly catches them?" I countered. Jason looked thoughtful. "Did you feel them anything? Like a presence or something?" The question caught me off guard. Jason wasn't usually one for metaphysical suggestions. "Yes," I admitted after a moment. It felt intentional, like it knew exactly what it was doing. And the weight of its attention was almost physical. I've never felt anything like it. Michael handed me a plate with pancakes. "Eat something." Everything seemed scarier at night. Whatever it was, it's gone now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We broke camp earlier than planned that day, though neither Michael nor Jason would admit it. My account had unsettled them enough that the appeal of another night by the river had diminished considerably. We made excuses about gathering enough footage for our channel and the threatening afternoon thunderstorms that were common in Florida summers. As we packed our gear, I kept glancing up at the embankment, half expecting to see something watching us from the tree line. The daylight revealed nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of palmettos, pines, and live oaks. "I've been camping in Florida woods my entire life," I told them as we hauled our packs up the trail. "I've encountered panthers, wild boars, even a black bear once." "This was different." "Different how?" Jason asked. I struggled to articulate what had set this experience apart. "Those animals, even predators, don't give you the sense they're studying you. This felt deliberate, intelligent." Michael adjusted his pack straps. "Could have been a homeless person. These woods aren't that far from civilization." But I knew it wasn't human, at least not in the conventional sense. The weight behind those footsteps, the deliberate tree knocking, the way it seemingly vanished when I shined my light toward it, none of it aligned with human behavior. The drive back to civilization was quieter than usual. We uploaded our footage and released a video about the camping trip a week later, but I never mentioned my nighttime encounter. Some experiences don't translate well to video content, and I had no desire to turn our channel into a repository for cryptid hunting or paranormal claims. In the years since that night, I've returned to the Alafia River many times, though never to that specific camping spot. The area has indeed become more heavily trafficked, as social media exposed its beauty to wider audiences. Perhaps that's for the best. More human presence keeps other things at bay. I've researched similar encounters across Florida, finding numerous accounts that parallel aspects of my experience. The tree knocking, the sudden silence of wildlife, the sense of being observed by something intelligent. These elements appear consistently in reports from the Ocala National Forest to the Everglades. What separates my encounter from many others is the absence of the characteristic odor associated with the skunk ape. This detail has led me to question whether what visited our camp that night was something else. Entirely, something perhaps less documented, but equally present in Florida's wilderness. Michael and Jason have since dismissed the incident, attributing my experience to an overactive imagination fueled by campfire stories and the disorienting effects of semi-sleep. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps my mind constructed a narrative around mundane nocturnal wildlife activity. But in moments of quiet reflection, I know what I felt that night. The weight of its attention, the deliberate nature of its movements, the intelligence behind its actions. Something watched us from the darkness along the Alafia River, something that wanted us to know it was there, yet remained just beyond the reach of definitive proof. And sometimes, late at night when I'm camping in other Florida wilderness areas, I find myself listening for that telltale silence that precedes its arrival, and wondering if tonight will be the night it returns. I needed to get away. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove my Jeep Wrangler along the winding roads toward the Great Smoky Mountains in April 2017. The vehicle that had once symbolized freedom now felt like a financial anchor dragging me down. Fresh from a breakup and drowning in payments I could barely afford, the mountains called to me with their promise of solitude. Nashville's sprawl faded in my rearview mirror as I headed east. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think. Too much time, perhaps. My life in northern Tennessee had grown stagnant. At 32, I wasn't where I'd imagined I would be. The relationship I thought would last had dissolved like morning fog, leaving me alone with mounting bills and a growing sense of restlessness. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park welcomed me with its majestic peaks and valleys. I spent that first day like any tourist might, visiting Klingman's Dome, wandering through gift shops filled with carved bears and local honey, snapping photos I'd probably never look at again. Without camping gear, I checked into a modest hotel just outside the park boundaries. The room was nothing special, but it served its purpose. That night, I sat on the small balcony overlooking the parking lot, nursing a beer from the gas station across the street. The mountains loomed in the distance, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-filled sky. Despite being surrounded by other travelers, a profound loneliness settled over me. I finished my drink and went to bed early, setting my alarm for dawn. Morning arrived with gentle persistence. I rose at 6 a.m. before most of the other guests stirred. After a quick breakfast of rubbery eggs and lukewarm coffee in the hotel's dining area, I packed my day bag with essentials, energy bars, water bottles, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small first aid kit, matches sealed in a waterproof container, and my handgun. Some might question bringing a firearm on a hike, but having grown up in rural America, it felt as natural as carrying water. The weight of it against my hip provided a sense of security that I'd never needed, but always appreciated. Besides, black bears were common in these parts, and though they rarely bothered humans, I preferred having options. I consulted my trail map while sitting in my Jeep. Grotto Falls seemed promising, scenic enough to be worth the journey, but not so popular that I'd be fighting crowds, especially on a weekday in early spring. The trail would offer a moderate hike that would occupy most of my day. The parking area held only 2 other vehicles when I arrived. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of pines and the earthy richness of soil, slowly warming under the morning sun. Birds called overhead, their songs echoing through the forest. I shouldered my pack, checked that I had everything, and set off down the trail. The path wound through dense forest, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. The trail itself was well maintained but showed few signs of recent foot traffic. Strangely, I encountered no other hikers as the morning progressed, and even the wildlife seemed scarce. Typically, these woods would be alive with squirrels darting between trees, deer browsing at the edges of clearings, or at least birds flitting through branches. Their absence registered faintly in my mind, but I dismissed it as simple bad luck. By mid-morning, the sky had transformed from clear blue to an overcast gray, not the threatening darkness that precedes a storm, but a soft, diffuse light that filtered through the trees in strange patterns. The effect was oddly beautiful, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the landscape. Around noon, I found a comfortable spot near a large oak tree and settled down for lunch. The forest stretched before me, a tapestry of greens and browns punctuated by the occasional wildflower. I unwrapped an energy bar and leaned back against the rough bark, savoring the silence. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle movement about 30 yards ahead. Initially, I thought it might be a deer or perhaps a bear moving through the underbrush. I squinted, trying to make out the shape among the trees. What I saw defied explanation. The figure was unmistakably humanoid in form, but there was something profoundly wrong about it. It appeared to stand upright on 2 legs, approximately the height of an average person, but its outline was unstable. The only way I can describe it is like looking at a projection that couldn't quite resolve itself. The figure seemed to shimmer with a silver translucence, as though it existed halfway between solid matter and light itself. I froze. The half-eaten energy bar slipped from my fingers as every muscle in my body tensed. My breath caught in my throat and a profound stillness settled over me, not from fear, though perhaps it should have been, but from absolute wonder. The figure remained motionless, seemingly studying me as intently as I studied it, though I could discern no facial features in the shifting silver mass. I felt with absolute certainty that I was being observed. What struck me most was not the strangeness of the encounter, but the emotions it evoked. Rather than terror, I felt an overwhelming sense of warmth radiating from this entity, a benevolence that seemed to wrap around me like a forgotten memory. There was something profoundly lonely about its presence, as though it had been alone for a very long time and was as surprised to find me as I was to find it. With tremendous effort, I managed to push a single word past my lips. "Hi." The sound seemed to hang in the air between us, fragile and insufficient. The figure tilted what I presumed to be its head, a gesture so human it made my heart ache. Then it moved, not with the lumbering gait of an animal or even the stride of a person, but with a fluid quickness that seemed to bend the very air around it. One moment it was directly ahead, the next it had shifted several yards to the left as though reality itself had hiccuped. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice stronger now, propelled by a desperate need to extend this impossible moment. The figure paused. A sound reached me then, not quite speech, not quite music, but something in between. The noise seemed to originate not from the entity, but from the air surrounding it, vibrating at frequencies that made my ears strain to interpret. The closest approximation my brain could manage sounded like, "Sorry I bothered," though the cadence was wrong. The syllables stretched and compressed as though English were a language it had studied but never spoken. Before I could respond, it moved again, faster this time, and simply vanished. Not gradually like something disappearing into the distance, but instantly, as though someone had switched off a projector. One moment it was there. The next, nothing remained but trees and shadows. I remained frozen for several minutes, afraid that any movement might dissolve the memory of what I'd just witnessed. Eventually, I rose on shaky legs and approached the spot where the figure had stood. The forest floor showed no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence that anything had been there at all. I spent the rest of that day searching the surrounding area, looking for any trace of the entity or clue to its nature. The rational part of my mind suggested hallucination, Perhaps exhaustion, dehydration, or even a reaction to something I'd eaten. But I felt physically fine, and the memory remained crystalline in its clarity. As daylight began to fade, I reluctantly made my way back to the trailhead. The forest seemed different now, charged with potential. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves drew my attention as I walked, hoping for another glimpse. None came. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the encounter over and over, analyzing every detail from the entity's fluid movement to the strange, almost language it had spoken. I wondered if I should tell someone, the park rangers perhaps, but what would I say? That I'd seen a silver ghost that radiated goodwill? They'd assume I was either lying or mentally unstable. Instead, I turned to the internet, searching for similar experiences in the Smoky Mountains. Most results led to standard ghost stories or folklore about the Cherokee, who had once inhabited these lands. Nothing matched what I had witnessed. No silver figures, no benevolent entities that moved like digital glitches in reality. After hours of fruitless research, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with silver light and wordless conversations. I returned home the next day, the drive back to Nashville passing in a blur of thoughts and questions. My apartment felt smaller, more confining than before. The problems that had seemed so overwhelming before my trip, the breakup, the financial struggles, now appeared trivial compared to the mystery I'd encountered. The days turned into weeks. I went through the motions of my life, working at the architectural firm where I'd been employed for the past 6 years, paying bills, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But internally something had fundamentally changed. The world seemed both larger and more fragile than before, as though I'd glimpsed behind a curtain I hadn't known existed. I told no one about what I'd seen. My friends noticed a change in me, a new quietness, a tendency to stare off into the distance during conversations, but attributed it to the recent breakup. Let them think I was heartbroken. It was easier than the truth. At night, I found myself drawing what I'd seen, filling notebook after notebook with sketches trying to capture the entity's strange, fluid form. None of my attempts came close to the reality, but the process became almost meditative, a way to keep the memory alive and tangible. I began researching quantum physics, multiverse theories, even paranormal phenomena, searching for any framework that might explain my experience. The more I learned, the more possibilities emerged. Perhaps I'd encountered something interdimensional, a being existing partially in our reality and partially elsewhere. Or maybe it was something entirely of this world but beyond our current scientific understanding. 3 months after the encounter, I returned to the Great Smoky Mountains. I told my boss I needed personal time, packed my Jeep, and drove back to the same hotel, requesting the same room as before. This time I came prepared for a longer stay. Day after day, I hiked to Grotto Falls and the surrounding area, sometimes sitting for hours in the spot where I'd seen the entity. I brought better equipment this time, a high-quality camera, an audio recorder, even an EMF detector I'd purchased from a paranormal research website. I felt slightly ridiculous using these tools, but my need for answers outweighed my embarrassment. Days passed with no sign of the silver figure. The woods remained as beautiful as ever, but the magic of that first encounter seemed to have vanished. After a week, I reluctantly returned home, my vacation days exhausted and my questions still unanswered. This pattern continued for over a year. Every few months, when I could spare the time and money, I would return to the Smoky Mountains. Each trip ended in disappointment, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop trying. The entity, whatever it was, had left an indelible mark on me. I needed to see it again, to confirm that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, to maybe even communicate properly this time. My obsession began to affect other areas of my life. I declined social invitations, preferring to spend evenings researching or planning my next trip. I started sleeping poorly, my dreams filled with glimpses of silver light that always faded before I could reach it. My work performance suffered enough that my supervisor called me in for a concerned discussion. "You're one of our best," he said, "but lately your mind seems elsewhere. Is everything all right?" I assured him it was just a rough patch, that I'd get back on track. He seemed unconvinced but willing to give me the benefit of the doubt. In the spring of 2018, almost exactly a year after my first encounter, I returned once more to the Smoky Mountains. This trip felt different from the beginning, more urgent somehow. The weather was remarkably similar to that day a year ago. Clear in the morning, gradually becoming overcast as noon approached. I hiked directly to the spot where I'd seen the entity before. Setting up my equipment with practiced efficiency, the camera stood ready on its tripod, the audio recorder and EMF detector placed on a nearby rock. Then I simply waited, forcing myself to be patient despite the anticipation building inside me. Hours passed. The forest sounds, birds calling, wind rustling through leaves, the distant murmur of water, became a meditative backdrop. I found myself drifting into an almost trance-like state, hyper-aware of my surroundings yet detached from them. That's when the atmosphere changed. It wasn't anything I could see or hear, but rather a shift in the quality of the air itself. A static-like charge that raised the hair on my arms and created pressure against my eardrums. The EMF detector emitted a sudden, high-pitched squeal before going silent entirely. 20 yards to my right, the air seemed to fold inward, creating a distortion like heat rising from asphalt. And then it was there. The silver figure, just as I remembered, its form shifting and flowing as though composed of mercury and light. This time, I was prepared. I activated the camera with a remote trigger, its mechanical whir sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The entity turned toward me, its featureless form somehow conveying curiosity. "Hello again," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been looking for you." The figure tilted its head in that same oddly human gesture I remembered. It moved closer, not with steps, but with that same reality-bending shift that compressed distance. Now it stood merely 10 feet away, close enough that I could see how the dappled sunlight seemed to pass through its form, creating prismatic effects within the silver substance. A sound emanated from it or around it similar to what I'd heard before. This time I concentrated fully on the noise, trying to decipher any pattern or meaning. The words, if they were words, seemed clearer now. "You returned. Unexpected." The voice wasn't male or female, but somehow both and neither, the tone resonating at frequencies that made my chest vibrate. I found I could understand it better if I didn't try to listen with my ears alone, but instead felt the vibrations with my entire body. "Yes," I replied. "I've been coming back for a year hoping to see you again." A ripple passed through its form like a shudder or perhaps laughter. "Time. Different. For you." The communication was stilted, as though each word required tremendous effort to translate into something I could comprehend. "What are you?" I asked, the question that had consumed me for a year finally emerging. The entity's form elongated, then contracted. "Same as you, different, perception limits." It gestured with what might have been an arm toward my camera. "Cannot capture. Cannot prove." I glanced at my equipment. The camera appeared to be functioning normally, its recording light blinking steadily. But somehow I knew it would show nothing when reviewed later. This interaction existed outside the realm of digital proof. "Are you from somewhere else?" I asked, struggling to frame the question in a way that made sense. Another ripple through its form. "Everywhere is somewhere else. Perspective determines reality." We continued this strange conversation for what felt like both minutes and hours, time itself seeming to flow differently in its presence. The entity's communication became slightly more fluid as we spoke, as though it were learning to translate its thoughts more effectively. I learned little concrete about its nature or origin. It seemed to exist in a state of perception fundamentally different from human experience, capable of seeing and moving through dimensions beyond our own. Whether it was a visitor from another universe, a manifestation of consciousness itself, or something entirely beyond my comprehension remained unclear. What became evident, however, was that it meant no harm. In fact, it seemed genuinely curious about human experience, asking questions about how I perceived time, color, and emotion. When I described loneliness, the entity's form pulsed with what I somehow knew was recognition. "Separation is universal constant," it communicated. "Connection, fleeting miracle." As our conversation progressed, I noticed the entity's form becoming less distinct, its edges blurring into the surrounding air. It was fading, not departing but losing the energy required to maintain its presence in my reality. "You're leaving," I said, unable to hide the disappointment in my voice. "Maintaining intersection." Difficult, it responded, the words coming with greater gaps between them. We'll remember you. Wait, I called out, desperate to extend our meeting. How can I find you again? The silver light dimmed further, now barely visible against the forest backdrop. Its final message reached me not as words but as a concept, planted directly into my mind. The separation between us was a construct of perception, not an absolute reality. It existed always, everywhere, though rarely visible to human consciousness. Our meeting had been a rare alignment of frequencies, unlikely but not impossible to repeat. And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the forest once more. As predicted, my equipment recorded nothing unusual, just hours of forest scenery and natural sounds with no silver entity in sight. The EMF detector had indeed malfunctioned. Its battery drained completely despite being new that morning. I should have felt frustrated by this lack of evidence, but instead, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The validation I'd sought wasn't meant to be captured on devices or shared with others. It was a personal revelation, changing how I perceived reality without requiring external proof. The drive back to Nashville felt different this time. Instead of obsessing over what I'd witnessed, I found myself contemplating what I'd learned. The entity had spoken of perspective determining reality, of connection as a miracle. These weren't just abstract philosophical concepts, but truths it embodied through its very existence. In the months that followed, I made significant changes in my life. I sold the Jeep Wrangler that had been such a financial burden, downsized my apartment, and reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my period of obsession. I approached my architectural work with renewed creativity, drawing inspiration from concepts of interconnected dimensions and fluid perspectives. I still returned to the Smoky Mountains occasionally, but no longer with desperate urgency. Sometimes I sat in that same spot in the forest, but now it was with appreciation rather than expectation. Whether or not I ever encountered the entity again seemed less important than carrying forward what I'd learned from our brief connections. 3 years have passed since my last encounter with the silver being. I've told this story in full only once before now, to a fellow hiker I met on a trail near Grotto Falls last autumn. She listened without judgment, then shared her own inexplicable experience in those same mountains, not with a silver entity, but with a moment when time seemed to fold in on itself, showing her glimpses of past and future simultaneously. Perhaps the Smoky Mountains hold special properties that thin the barriers between dimensions. Or maybe such phenomena occur everywhere, but only in places of natural beauty do we slow down enough to notice them. What I know with certainty is that reality is vaster and more permeable than most of us ever realize. I carry a sketchbook with me always now, filling its pages not just with drawings of what I've seen, but impressions of what might exist beyond our limited perception. Sometimes in the moments between sleeping and waking, I catch glimpses of silver light at the corners of my vision. Whether memory or ongoing connection, I welcome these moments as reminders that the universe contains wonders we have only begun to comprehend. The entity once told me that separation is a universal constant, and connection a fleeting miracle. I've come to believe the opposite is true. We are fundamentally connected to everything, and it is our perception of separation that creates the illusion of isolation. Sometimes in rare and precious moments that illusion falls away, revealing the truth that has been there all along. And perhaps that is the most profound horror of all, not that we are alone in an indifferent universe, but that we are intimately connected to everything yet unable to fully perceive this reality through our limited senses. The terror lies not in what might be lurking in the darkness, but in how little of existence we're equipped to comprehend. I continue to watch the woods, the sky, the spaces between moments, waiting, wondering, and most of all, remaining open to the impossible. Camping and hiking in the backcountry has been my passion since I was 18 years old. Growing up in Montana, I developed an affinity for the outdoors that followed me into adulthood. By 2018, I had explored some of the most remote and beautiful places across the American West, from the dense forests of Olympic National Park to the stark beauty of Death Valley. The wilderness has always called to me, offering solace from the noise of everyday life. My work as an environmental consultant afforded me opportunities to visit places most people never see. The job required extended periods in urban settings, analyzing data and writing reports, but I balanced this with weekend excursions into nature whenever possible. These escapes kept me grounded and reminded me why I chose my career path. I've always been drawn to places with histories, locations where the land itself seems to hold memories. Growing up in a house situated on what was once Native American land, I developed a sensitivity to places that feel different. My childhood home had its share of unexplainable occurrences, footsteps when no one was there, doors that opened on their own, whispers in empty rooms. These experiences instilled in me not fear, but respect for things beyond ordinary understanding. Despite my extensive outdoor experience, I've encountered situations that defied explanation. I've heard strange sounds echo across mountain valleys at midnight. I've felt watched while alone in remote canyons. I've seen shadows move against the laws of light and physics. Yet none of these experiences prepared me for what happened in the mountains north of Phoenix in October 2018. My colleague Michael and I had worked 14 consecutive days on an environmental impact assessment for a proposed development. The project had been contentious, the hours long, and by the end we were both mentally exhausted. We needed an escape, somewhere quiet, remote, and untouched. I suggested a spot I'd discovered years earlier in the mountains just north of Phoenix, an area rarely frequented by other hikers or campers due to its difficult access. It offered stunning views of the Salt River below and complete isolation from civilization. Michael agreed immediately. He was an experienced outdoorsman himself, having served in the Army and participated in survival training. At 32, he was 3 years my junior, but possessed practical skills I admired. We made plans to leave Friday afternoon, taking separate vehicles in case work called one of us back early. We would meet at the trailhead, hike in, and spend 2 nights disconnected from everything and everyone. Neither of us could have anticipated what waited for us in those mountains. The drive from Phoenix took approximately 2 hours, the urban sprawl gradually giving way to saguaro-dotted hillsides and finally the rugged mountain terrain. I arrived first at our meeting point, a small unmarked pull-off that most people drove past without noticing. My Jeep Wrangler handled the increasingly rough road with ease, though the final mile required careful navigation around rocks and through shallow creek beds. Michael arrived 20 minutes later in his Ford Ranger, loaded with camping gear and a cooler of provisions. The October air carried a pleasant crispness, hovering around 70 degrees, perfect weather for hiking and outdoor sleeping. We anticipated temperatures might drop into the 50s at night, but our equipment would easily handle such conditions. "This place is even more remote than you described," Michael said as he pulled his backpack from his truck. "How did you find it?" "Stumbled upon it 3 years ago while doing field research," I replied. "Got slightly lost, found this trail, and followed it out of curiosity. Been coming back ever since." We organized our gear methodically: basic camping essentials, food for 3 days, water filtration systems, first aid supplies, and tools. Michael brought his hunting knife and a revolver, standard practice for him in remote areas where mountain lions occasionally roamed. I packed my bolt-action rifle primarily for the same reason. The unmarked trail began as a narrow path through dense manzanita bushes before opening into ponderosa pine forest. As we hiked, I noted subtle differences from my previous visits. The trail seemed less defined in places, and several deadfalls across the path hadn't been there before. Nothing concerning, just changes that occur naturally in wilderness areas. After 20 minutes of steady climbing, Michael stopped abruptly. "Do you smell that?" I paused and inhaled deeply. The air carried an acrid undertone, like something rotting but mixed with an odd metallic quality. "Probably a dead animal somewhere off-trail," I suggested, though the scent didn't quite match that explanation. We continued hiking, but I noticed Michael glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. When questioned, he simply shrugged and said, "Feels like we're being watched." I'd experienced the same sensation on previous solo hikes. The wilderness has a way of triggering primal instincts, atavistic responses that our ancestors relied upon for survival. I dismissed it as natural caution in an unfamiliar environment, though Michael had extensive wilderness experience and wasn't prone to jumpiness. After 45 minutes, we reached the campsite. a relatively flat area approximately 50 yards from the edge of a steep cliff, overlooking the winding Salt River below. The view was spectacular, with rugged mountains extending to the horizon and the river glinting like molten silver in the late afternoon sun. Worth the hike, Michael acknowledged as we set down our packs. We established camp efficiently, setting up our individual tents about 15 feet apart and creating a small fire pit ringed with stones. I collected dead wood while Michael prepared the area for cooking. By sunset, we had a modest fire going and dinner underway. That's when I first noticed the silence. In wilderness areas, silence is actually a symphony of subtle sounds. Insects buzzing, birds calling, leaves rustling. But as darkness descended, an unnatural quiet enveloped us. No cicadas chirped, no nocturnal birds called. Even the gentle breeze seemed to die, leaving the flames of our fire rising straight upward without flickering. "It's unusually quiet," I remarked casually, trying to mask my growing discomfort. Michael nodded slowly, scanning the darkening perimeter of our camp. Too quiet. We sat around the fire after dinner, discussing work, life, and our respective plans for the coming months. Michael mentioned a potential job opportunity in Colorado that would involve less office time and more field work, something he'd been wanting. I shared my thoughts about pursuing a master's degree in environmental science. Ordinary conversation in an extraordinary setting, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The absence of ambient forest sounds continued, creating an atmosphere that felt pressurized as if the air itself had weight. We spoke more quietly than usual, perhaps unconsciously responding to the abnormal silence. Around 9:30 p.m., Michael was mid-sentence when we heard it, a distinct snapping sound approximately 30 yards away in the darkness beyond our firelight. We both froze, listening intently. It could have been a branch breaking under the weight of a nocturnal animal, but the complete absence of follow-up sounds, no rustling underbrush, no retreating footsteps, contradicted that explanation. Probably just a branch falling, I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Michael nodded but placed his hand on his revolver, which he'd kept within reach since we'd arrived. We resumed our conversation with forced casualness, but our attention had shifted outward, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. 10 minutes later, another crack, this time from a different direction. Then another from yet another position around our perimeter. "We're being circled," Michael whispered, his military training evident in his controlled, measured response. "Could be animals," I replied, though the pattern seemed deliberate, methodical. We added more wood to the fire, expanding our circle of light. I retrieved my rifle from my tent and loaded it discreetly. We maintained conversation at normal volume, not wanting whatever was out there to know we were alarmed. At 10:45 p.m., I stood to stretch my legs. What happened next occurred with such sudden violence that I initially couldn't process it. A rock the size of a baseball hurtled from the darkness, missing my head by inches and striking a tree behind me with enough force to take off chunks of bark. "Get down!" Michael shouted, drawing his revolver and moving into a defensive position. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dropped to a crouch, gripping my rifle. "Who's out there?" I called into the darkness. "This is private property." It wasn't actually private land, but the lie seemed potentially useful if we were dealing with humans intent on mischief. No response came. Not a word, not a laugh, not even the sound of movement. Just that oppressive silence, now made more menacing by the demonstrated presence of something. "We should sweep the perimeter," Michael suggested, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We agreed on a methodical approach, back to back, moving in a slow circle around our campsite, weapons ready. The firelight created more problems than it solved, destroying our night vision and turning the forest beyond into an impenetrable wall of darkness. We used flashlights sparingly, aware they made us perfect targets while revealing little of our surroundings. Our search revealed nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign anything had been there at all. The rock itself provided no clues. It was local stone, similar to countless others in the area. When we returned to the fire, Michael's expression had changed from alertness to genuine concern. "Someone's messing with us," he said quietly. "But why? And how did they get here? We'd have seen another vehicle at the trailhead. Maybe they hiked in from another direction." Maybe they've been here all along. We agreed to take watches through the night, with Michael taking the first shift while I tried to sleep. Inside my tent, I lay fully clothed on top of my sleeping bag, rifle at my side, listening to the unnatural silence and wondering what waited in the darkness beyond. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my subconscious refusing to fully surrender to vulnerability. At 2 a.m., Michael woke me from my watch. His expression told me nothing had occurred during his vigil, but the tension hadn't left his shoulders. "All quiet," he reported. "Too quiet. Not even a breeze." I nodded, taking the flashlight he offered. "Get some rest. I'll wake you at dawn, or sooner if needed." Once Michael retreated to his tent, I sat beside the dying embers of our fire, adding just enough wood to maintain a small flame. The darkness pressed in from all sides, absolute and consuming. Stars overhead shone with unusual brilliance, their cold light offering no comfort against the oppressive black of the surrounding forest. During my military training years earlier, I had learned techniques for maintaining alertness during night watches. I employed them now, changing positions regularly, focusing on different sounds and sectors systematically, keeping my mind engaged without fixating on fears or imagination. At approximately 3:20 a.m., I detected movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow shifting against the backdrop of other shadows. I turned slowly, raising my flashlight but not immediately activating it. Movement ceased. I waited, controlling my breathing, scanning methodically. There, approximately 40 yards away, something moved between trees. I switched on the flashlight, directing its beam toward the location. Nothing visible reflected the light. No eyeshine, no silhouette, just empty forest. Yet I remained certain something had been there moments before. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air developing a biting edge that hadn't been present before. My breath fogged in front of my face, though October nights in this region rarely get cold enough for such an effect. The fire dimmed despite the fresh wood I'd added, its light receding as if being actively suppressed. I stood, gripping my rifle with one hand and the flashlight with the other, turning in a slow circle to survey our perimeter. The sensation of being observed intensified, like physical pressure against my skin. Not general observation, but focused attention, a predatory assessment. A low, sustained sound emerged from the direction of the cliff edge. Not quite a hum, not quite a whistle, but something between the two that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my skull throb. The sound maintained a consistent pitch and volume, defying acoustical logic given the open space beyond the cliff. I considered waking Michael, but hesitated. Nothing concrete had actually happened. I had only subjective impressions and responses. As I debated the decision, small objects began to hit the ground around our campsite. Pebbles, twigs, and pine cones falling like gentle rain. Not thrown with force like the earlier rock, but descending vertically as if dropped from above, though nothing was visible overhead. The shower of objects continued for approximately 2 minutes before ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. The strange humming sound faded simultaneously, leaving that oppressive silence once again. I checked my watch. 3:47 a.m. 3 hours until dawn. I moved closer to Michael's tent, determined to maintain vigilance until first light revealed what lurked in the darkness. The rest of my watch passed without further incident, though the sensation of being observed never diminished. As gray light finally began filtering through the trees, I exhaled a breath I felt I'd been holding for hours. Whatever had been out there had withdrawn, for now. I woke Michael as the first direct sunlight reached our campsite, giving him a full account of the night's events. He listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "I believe you," he said simply when I finished. "But believing doesn't explain anything." We surveyed the campsite in daylight, finding the scattered pebbles and organic debris from the night's strange shower. Nothing appeared damaged or disturbed otherwise. We prepared a quick breakfast of instant coffee and protein bars, discussing our options with the rational clarity morning often brings. "We could pack up and leave," Michael suggested. "No shame in making a strategic retreat." I considered this. The logical choice was obvious, leave immediately. Yet something in me resisted. Let's give it one more day. We came here to unwind, and one rock throw could have been kids or hunters messing with us. Michael looked unconvinced. And the rest? The sounds? The objects falling from nowhere? I had no explanation but found myself reluctant to flee what might have natural explanations we hadn't yet discovered. If anything else happens, we leave immediately. No questions, no hesitation. Against his better judgment, Michael agreed. We spent the day exploring the area around our campsite, always staying within sight of each other. The daytime forest seemed entirely normal. Birds sang, insects buzzed, small animals rustled through underbrush. Whatever strangeness had pervaded the night appeared to have dissipated in sunlight. We hiked to a small waterfall approximately a mile from camp, filtered fresh water for our supplies, and even managed to catch 2 trout from a pool below the falls. The normalcy of these activities began to erode our apprehension. Perhaps the previous night had been an anomaly, a combination of fatigue, unfamiliar surroundings, and natural phenomena misinterpreted through the lens of darkness. By late afternoon, we had returned to camp and were preparing dinner. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows through the trees. We established a larger fire than the previous night, both for cooking and to extend our perimeter of visibility once darkness fell. As the sun disappeared and twilight deepened, the forest gradually fell silent again. The transition was subtle, birds calling less frequently than not at all, insect sounds diminishing until absent. By the time full darkness established itself, that unnatural silence had returned. "It's happening again," Michael observed quietly, feeding another log to our fire. We positioned ourselves back to back beside the fire, weapons within reach but not in hand. The night stretched before us, hours of darkness to endure before dawn would bring relief. We maintained conversation, discussing neutral topics, recent films, sports, books we'd read, anything to establish normalcy against the growing sense of wrongness surrounding us. At 8:37 p.m., the first incident occurred. A pine cone struck Michael's shoulder, not thrown with significant force but with enough velocity to suggest it hadn't simply fallen. We both stood immediately, scanning the darkness with flashlights, seeing nothing unusual. 15 minutes later, a handful of small pebbles clattered against my tent. Again we searched and found nothing. The incidents continued at irregular intervals, small objects thrown from different directions, never with enough force to cause harm but clearly deliberate. "It's toying with us," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled tension. At 9:20 p.m., the pattern changed dramatically. A rock the size of a softball hurtled from the darkness and struck Michael's tent, ripping through the nylon fabric and leaving a jagged hole. Unlike the earlier projectiles, this one came with considerable force. "That's it," Michael said, grabbing his revolver. "We're dealing with this now." He fired 2 shots into the air, the sound explosively loud in the silent forest. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded us to the darkness beyond. As the echoes of gunshots faded, we heard it. Movement in the forest. Not furtive or subtle, but massive and deliberate. Something large was moving rapidly through the trees, circling our position. Branches snapped, undergrowth crushed. The sounds indicated something substantial, larger than a human, moving with purpose and speed that defied easy explanation. Michael fired another shot in the direction of the sounds. The movement paused momentarily, then resumed from a different position, now behind us, now to our left, now ahead. Whatever it was, it moved with impossible quickness, positioning itself around us in ways that suggested multiple entities rather than a single creature. We stood back to back, weapons raised, turning slowly to track the sounds of movement. My flashlight beam caught a brief glimpse of something dark moving between trees approximately 50 yards out. Tall, indistinct, gone before I could focus on details. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "Movement only," Michael replied. "Nothing clear." The circling continued for approximately 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. The forest returned to absolute silence, more oppressive than before. We maintained our defensive position, senses straining against the darkness. Then came the sound, that same low, vibrating hum from the previous night, but louder now, emanating from beyond the cliff edge. It started at the threshold of hearing, but gradually increased in volume and intensity until it seemed to resonate inside my skull, making cohesive thought difficult. "What is that?" Michael asked, his voice barely audible over the strange sound. I had no answer, but I felt compelled to investigate. The sound originated from an impossible location, beyond the cliff edge where nothing could stand, where no human or animal could position itself. Yet something was there producing that maddening noise. As the hum intensified, our fire diminished, the flames shrinking despite the ample fuel. Darkness crept closer, contracting our safe zone of visibility. The air temperature dropped precipitously, our breath now clearly visible in the firelight. Then came the assault. A large branch flew from the darkness, striking Michael's tent and completely collapsing it. Before we could react, more objects hurled from multiple directions simultaneously. Rocks, branches, chunks of earth, even parts of cacti. They came not just from the surrounding forest, but impossibly from beyond the cliff edge as well, flying upward over the rim before raining down on our position. "We're leaving now," Michael shouted, ducking as a rock whistled past his head. We grabbed our backpacks, already packed with essentials in case rapid departure became necessary. I managed to snatch my sleeping bag and first aid kit before a branch struck my tent, collapsing it completely. Michael retrieved his satellite phone and GPS device. Everything else we abandoned. The barrage continued as we fled, objects striking the ground around us with increasing force. We ran toward the trail, flashlights bouncing wildly, the sounds of pursuit immediately evident behind us. Whatever had been circling us was now following, crashing through undergrowth with terrifying speed. The trail appeared intermittently in our flashlight beams as we ran, more navigating by memory and instinct than by clear visibility. The sounds of pursuit remained consistent behind us, not gaining but not falling behind either, maintaining a distance of approximately 50 yards. The strange humming sound accompanied us, somehow projecting forward as if to surround our position. It affected my equilibrium, making running in a straight line increasingly difficult. My head throbbed with each pulse of the sound, vision occasionally blurring. After approximately 10 minutes of sustained flight, Michael called for a momentary halt, pulling me behind a large boulder beside the trail. We extinguished our flashlights and listened. The sounds of pursuit stopped simultaneously. The humming continued, but at reduced volume. "It's tracking our lights," Michael whispered, his military training evident in his rapid tactical assessment. We waited, controlling our breathing, listening intently. The forest remained silent except for that persistent hum, now seeming to move in a circular pattern around our position, as if searching. "We need to reach the vehicles," I said quietly. "We have about 20 more minutes on this trail." Michael checked his GPS device, the screen dimmed to minimal brightness. "If we cut directly east through the forest, we can reach the road in approximately 12 minutes, then follow it south to the parking area." Going off-trail in darkness carried significant risks, but remaining on the established path seemed more dangerous given the circumstances. We agreed on Michael's suggestion and prepared to move again. "On 3, he whispered. "Lights off unless absolutely necessary. Move quickly, but quietly." We emerged from our temporary shelter and plunged into the forest, navigating by the occasional glimpse of stars through the canopy and the dim screen of the GPS. Behind us, the humming sound suddenly intensified and the crashing pursuit resumed, now coming from multiple directions simultaneously, converging on our former position. We moved as rapidly as possible through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches scratching at our faces and arms. The sounds of pursuit fanned out, as if whatever followed us had lost our direct trail and was searching systematically. After approximately 5 minutes of off-trail progress, the humming changed character, developing a pulsing quality, rhythmic and somehow purposeful. It reminded me of Morse code, though I couldn't identify any pattern. The humming surrounded us now, coming from all directions, making it impossible to determine which way to flee. Michael stopped abruptly, gripping my arm. He pointed silently to our right. There, approximately 30 yards away between the trees, was a faint bluish illumination, hovering about 6 feet above the ground. The light didn't disperse or illuminate its surroundings as a normal light source would. It remained contained, almost solid in appearance. As we watched, it moved slowly between trees with deliberate purpose, stopping occasionally as if sensing or searching. We remained motionless, barely breathing. The light paused, hovering, then abruptly changed direction, heading directly toward our position. We dropped to the ground behind a fallen log, pressing ourselves into the earth. The bluish illumination approached steadily, stopping approximately 15 feet from our position. The humming sound intensified painfully, pressure building in my sinuses and behind my eyes until I feared my head might burst. Beside me, Michael pressed his hands against his ears, his face contorted in silent agony. The light expanded, brightening until it illuminated a circular area approximately 20 feet in diameter. Within this illumination, shadows moved, not cast by objects within the light but seemingly composed of darkness itself, moving independently like liquid void. The pressure in my head reached unbearable levels. Just as unconsciousness threatened to overtake me, the light contracted suddenly and shot upward through the trees, taking the humming sound with it. The forest plunged back into darkness and silence. We lay motionless for several minutes, neither daring to speak or move. When Michael finally touched my shoulder, indicating we should continue, my limbs felt leaden, responding sluggishly to commands. We rose and resumed our eastward progress, moving more cautiously now, constantly scanning for signs of the blue light's return. We reached the dirt road 17 minutes later. Emerging from the forest in a state of exhausted vigilance, the road stretched north and south, a pale ribbon under starlight. No sounds of pursuit followed us from the forest, but we maintained caution, moving southward toward the parking area with weapons ready. The road provided easier movement but greater visibility. We stayed near the forest edge, ready to take cover if necessary. The night had deepened, temperatures continuing to drop, though whether from natural progression or the influence of whatever pursued us remained unclear. Michael checked his watch. Just after midnight. We should reach the vehicles in about 15 minutes at this pace. We maintained silence as we walked, communicating through hand signals when necessary. My mind raced through possible explanations for what we'd experienced. Nothing in my considerable outdoor experience offered rational answers. Whatever hunted us defied conventional understanding. After 10 minutes of steady progress, we rounded a bend in the road and saw the small pull-off where our vehicles waited. Relief flooded through me, quickly replaced by renewed caution. If something had followed us this far, the clearing would make us perfect targets. We approached carefully, scanning the area for any signs of disturbance. Our vehicles appeared untouched, exactly as we'd left them. The normality of the scene seemed almost surreal after what we'd experienced. As we stepped into the clearing, the humming sound returned, distant at first, then rapidly intensifying. Not from the forest this time, but from above. We looked up simultaneously as the blue light bloomed in the sky directly overhead, expanding rapidly. The vehicles. "Now!" Michael shouted, abandoning stealth. We sprinted the final distance, fumbling for keys. I reached my Jeep first, hands shaking as I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside. The humming had become physically painful again, vibrating through my body. The blue light above us pulsed rhythmically, growing in intensity. Michael reached his truck, wrenching the door open. As he did, objects began raining down around us. Not natural forest debris this time, but items from our abandoned campsite. My collapsed tent struck the hood of my Jeep. Michael's cooking equipment clattered onto the road. Our abandoned sleeping bags, fire pit stones, even the charred logs from our fire fell from the sky. Ammunition in a final assault. I started my engine as a rock shattered my passenger window. Michael's truck roared to life simultaneously. Without waiting to secure seatbelts or close doors properly, we accelerated onto the dirt road, stones and equipment bouncing off our vehicles as we fled. In my rearview mirror, the blue light contracted suddenly and vanished, leaving natural darkness behind. The humming ceased. The rain of objects stopped. I maintained speed, navigating the rough road by headlights, adrenaline keeping my focus sharp despite exhaustion. Michael's truck followed close behind, his high beams supplementing my illumination of the road ahead. We drove in this formation for 20 minutes, reaching the paved highway with a sense of crossing some threshold of safety. Only then did I pull to the roadside, my entire body trembling with delayed shock and exhaustion. Michael parked behind me and we met between vehicles, neither speaking immediately as we processed our escape. "What the hell was that?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "I don't know. I've never experienced anything like it." We compared vehicles. Both had sustained damage from the final barrage. My passenger window was completely shattered, Michael's windshield bore a spiderweb crack across the driver's side. Various dents and scratches marked both vehicles where projectiles had struck. "We need to report this," Michael suggested. "Park rangers, local police, someone." I considered this suggestion carefully. And tell them what? That we were attacked by invisible entities that threw rocks and made our heads hurt? That some kind of blue light hunted us through the forest? He sighed, acknowledging the problem. "So we just walk away? Pretend it didn't happen?" "No," I replied firmly. "We don't go back there. We warn others without sounding crazy, and we try to understand what happened." We agreed to meet the following day after getting some rest. The drive back to Phoenix passed in a blur of fatigue and lingering fear. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror triggered momentary panic. Every unusual sound caused my heart to race. I reached home just before 3 a.m., securing my doors and windows before collapsing into bed still fully clothed. Sleep, when it finally came, brought nightmares of blue lights and humming sounds that pursued me through endless forests where I ran in slow motion, never making progress, never escaping. In the days following our hasty retreat from the mountains, Michael and I devoted considerable time to researching the area and similar experiences. We met at a small cafe, both obviously sleep-deprived and jumpy, comparing notes on what we'd discovered. The location had a history, not well documented in official records but persistent in local lore. Several hikers had gone missing in those mountains over the past decade. 2 had been found miles from their last known positions, disoriented and suffering from exposure, with no memory of how they'd traveled so far. Others were never found. Local indigenous stories described the area as thin ground, a place where the boundary between worlds lacked normal stability. Their oral histories warned against camping there, especially during specific lunar phases. Cross-referencing astronomical data, I discovered our ill-fated trip had coincided exactly with one such phase. "What do you make of this?" Michael asked, showing me a news article from 2016. 3 hikers had reported strange lights and sounds in the same general region. Authorities had dismissed their account as hallucinations caused by consuming wild mushrooms mistaken for edible varieties. Too similar to be coincidence, I noted, especially the description of the light and the thrown objects. We found other accounts scattered across obscure forums and local newspaper archives. Some mentioned the humming sound. Others described the sudden silence. Many referenced feeling watched or followed. None provided satisfactory explanations. After 2 weeks of research, we made a deliberate decision to stop pursuing answers. The investigation was affecting our sleep, our work, our daily functioning. Michael began experiencing auditory hallucinations, that distinctive humming sound at random moments. I developed an irrational fear of darkness, sleeping with lights on for the first time since childhood. We filed a report with the Forest Service, describing our experience in carefully sanitized terms: harassment by unknown parties, projectiles thrown at our campsite, strange noises possibly made by humans trying to frighten us. The report was acknowledged, but generated no apparent investigation. That winter, a solo hiker went missing in the same region. Search parties found no trace except his vehicle at a trailhead 5 miles from where we had parked. His backpack was discovered 3 weeks later, 30 miles away across impossible terrain with no other signs of his presence. I've never returned to those mountains. My outdoor activities continue, but I select destinations more carefully now, researching historical accounts and local legends before committing to remote locations. I carry more sophisticated communication equipment and never travel without informing multiple people of my exact intended route and schedule. Michael moved to Colorado in 2020, accepting that job opportunity we had discussed during our final night at the campsite. We maintain contact but rarely discuss what happened. When the topic arises, our conversations quickly turn circular, revisiting questions without answers, theories without conclusions. What pursued us through those mountains in October 2018? I cannot say with certainty. The rational explanations, other humans with advanced technology, elaborate pranks, shared hallucinations induced by environmental factors, all fail to account for specific elements of our experience. The irrational explanations offer no comfort. Sometimes while camping in different forests, I awaken at night and listen carefully to the ambient sounds. The chorus of insects, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the whisper of wind through leaves. These natural sounds now represent safety to me. It's their absence that triggers alarm, that brings memories flooding back of the oppressive silence that preceded the terror. If you find yourself in the mountains north of Phoenix and discover an unmarked trail leading to a campsite overlooking the Salt River, consider this account not as sensational storytelling but as earnest warning. Some places reject human presence. Some territories remain unclaimed for reasons beyond our understanding. And if during your wilderness travels, you experience unnatural silence descending like a physical weight, if you feel watched from all directions simultaneously, if objects begin to fall or fly without apparent cause, do not investigate. Do not attempt contact or communication. Leave immediately without delay or debate. The wilderness contains wonders worth experiencing, beauty worth observing, solitude worth seeking. But not all solitude is benign. Not all observation is passive. Not all territories welcome exploration, and some questions are better left unasked for fear of receiving answers. The discovery occurred during early autumn of 2022, when the forests surrounding my rural hometown began their annual transformation. I consider myself a practical person, someone grounded in reality and skeptical of supernatural claims, though I maintain a scientist's openness to phenomena beyond current understanding. This mindset served me well during my weekend explorations of the undeveloped woodlands near my property. I had recently purchased a modest cabin approximately 30 miles from the nearest town, seeking respite from corporate life. The surrounding forest offered both recreation and tranquility, with established hiking trails that satisfied my initial curiosity. However, after several months of familiarity with these standard paths, I developed an interest in venturing beyond mapped territory. During a particularly clear Saturday morning in September, I noticed an unmarked trail veering northwest from the main pathway. According to my topographical maps, this area remained largely unexplored by recreational hikers. Equipped with my standard gear, compass, water supply, emergency provisions, communication device, and protective items, I documented my intended route before proceeding into this unfamiliar territory. The first mile presented typical deciduous woodland, consistent with the regional ecosystem I had come to know well. Oak, maple, and birch trees dominated the landscape, with undergrowth that indicated regular wildlife activity. Nothing suggested abnormality or reason for concern. I methodically noted distinctive landmarks and took periodic compass readings to ensure a straightforward return journey. Approximately 90 minutes into this exploration, the environment underwent a striking transition. The diverse hardwood forest abruptly yielded to an exclusive stand of pine trees. The demarcation appeared unusually precise, almost artificially so, as though someone had intentionally cultivated this monoculture. The pines stood tall and densely packed, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where sunlight filtered through in narrow, dust-illuminated beams. The transition affected more than visual perception. The acoustic properties changed dramatically. The forest floor, covered in fallen needles, absorbed sound in a manner that created an unnatural stillness. Even common woodland sounds, birds calling, small animals moving through underbrush, seemed strangely absent. The air carried a concentrated resinous scent that, while not unpleasant, possessed an intensity that suggested confinement rather than open woodland. Despite growing unease regarding this ecological anomaly, scientific curiosity compelled me to continue forward. I documented the coordinates of this boundary and proceeded with heightened attention to my surroundings. The uniformity of the pine forest created navigational challenges. Without distinctive landmarks, I relied more heavily on my compass and GPS tracking. After advancing approximately another mile into this homogeneous environment, I encountered the first inexplicable event. A child's voice pierced the unnatural silence, a girl, sounding approximately 8 to 10 years old, calling desperately for her father. The voice emanated from behind my position, characterized by panic that triggered an immediate protective response. I turned rapidly, expecting to find a lost child requiring assistance. Nothing appeared in my visual field. The space behind me contained only pine trees extending into shadowed distance. I called out a response offering help and requesting the child's location. My voice seemed absorbed by the surrounding environment, traveling less distance than physics would suggest possible in an open woodland setting. After several attempts at communication yielded no response, I considered options. A lost child constituted a genuine emergency requiring action, yet the situation contained concerning inconsistencies. The voice had sounded close, within 20 yards by acoustic estimation, yet no visual evidence supported a human presence. Furthermore, this remote location made a child's presence highly improbable. The nearest residential area required crossing difficult terrain unsuitable for young hikers. I decided to continue forward while maintaining heightened awareness, reasoning that if someone genuinely needed assistance, they would likely call out again or attempt to locate the source of my response. Approximately 60 seconds later, as predicted, the child's voice recurred. This second auditory event contained identical linguistic content, the same words calling for daddy with the same inflection and emotional quality. However, the acoustic proximity had increased significantly. The voice now sounded approximately 10 yards closer than before, though again, visual inspection revealed no human presence. My discomfort intensified. The identical nature of the vocalization suggested a recording rather than genuine human communication, yet no technological source appeared evident. Additionally, the calculated movement pattern, approaching from behind rather than maintaining static position or moving randomly, suggested intentionality inconsistent with either a lost child or abandoned recording device. Increased my pace while maintaining my original direction, documenting the experience through voice notes on my phone while continuously scanning my surroundings. The environmental characteristics remained consistent as I progressed deeper into the pine forest. Sunlight diminished as the canopy thickened overhead, creating a premature twilight effect despite the mid-afternoon hour. Temperature decreased noticeably, approximately 5 degrees based on my equipment readings, without corresponding weather changes or elevation differences that would explain such variation. Precisely 118 seconds after the second auditory event, the child's voice manifested again. This third occurrence demonstrated two significant changes. First, the acoustic proximity suggested a position directly behind me, within arm's reach. Second, the emotional quality had intensified, with vocal characteristics suggesting extreme distress rather than mere confusion. I executed an immediate, complete rotation while simultaneously stepping backward. The physical space around me remained devoid of visible presence. No movement disturbed the pine needles covering the forest floor. No disruption appeared in the air that would suggest a recently vacated position. Before I could process this third event, a new auditory phenomenon occurred. A male voice, deep, measured, and addressing me directly, spoke from an approximate position 2 feet to my right. The voice made a statement regarding my presence in his forest, though the exact wording became difficult to recall in subsequent analysis. This development transformed my scientific curiosity into genuine concern for personal safety. The calculated positioning of these auditory events, behind and beside me, progressively closer, never visible, suggested a deliberate attempt to disorient and intimidate rather than genuine communication. I unsheathed my tactical knife, a standard safety precaution for wilderness exploration rather than an intended weapon, and initiated an immediate retreat, maintaining a backward-facing position while establishing fastest possible movement toward my entry point. My physical dimensions and military background typically provide confidence when facing uncertain situations. However, this experience generated a psychological response disproportionate to tangible threat evidence. The violation of established physical laws, sounds without sources, voices without bodies, created a fundamental disruption of reality that intellectual preparation cannot adequately address. My retreat required navigational precision despite emotional distress. The homogeneous environment offered minimal distinctive features for orientation, making compass readings essential despite the urgency of departure. I maintained awareness of directional integrity while executing a controlled evacuation at maximum sustainable speed. Approximately 45 seconds into this withdrawal, acoustic phenomena intensified in both frequency and complexity. The child's voice continued at intervals of approximately 15 seconds, maintaining position directly behind me, regardless of my movement speed or directional changes. The male voice established a similar pattern to my right side, now accompanied by audible footsteps that synchronized with my own movement, but remained visually unverifiable. Additional sound elements manifested in succession, whispered conversations at the threshold of audibility, something substantial moving through underbrush that should not have existed in this needle-covered environment. Metallic scraping reminiscent of tools or implements being dragged across hard surfaces. These acoustic events demonstrated strategic positioning, creating a hemispheric pattern around my forward path that suggested choreographed movement by multiple entities. The effect generated psychological pressure to deviate from my chosen evacuation route, potentially driving me deeper into the pine forest rather than toward its boundary. I recognized this pattern as consistent with predatory herding behavior, where coordinated actions by multiple agents direct prey movement toward predetermined destinations. This recognition reinforced my commitment to maintain my established course regardless of psychological discomfort. The physical environment began exhibiting subtle alterations that complicated navigation. Light conditions deteriorated beyond expected forest canopy effects, creating a premature darkness that challenged visual orientation. Temperature continued decreasing without environmental justification. Most concerning familiar landmarks noted during my inward journey appeared altered or absent upon return, requiring exclusive reliance on compass readings rather than visual confirmation. Despite these compounding challenges, I maintained forward progress while implementing controlled breathing techniques to manage physiological stress responses. My military training provided valuable protocols for maintaining operational effectiveness during high-stress scenarios, though this situation exceeded established parameters for wilderness emergencies. After approximately 17 minutes of sustained movement through increasingly hostile conditions, I detected environmental changes indicating proximity to the pine forest boundary. Light quality improved incrementally. Temperature began normalizing. Acoustic properties demonstrated reduced absorption characteristics consistent with transitioning to mixed forest. These promising indicators coincided with escalation in unexplained phenomena. The auditory events increased in volume and frequency, creating an overlapping pattern that approached continuous sound. The content evolved from discrete communications to a composite of human and non-human vocalizations, crying, whispering, and sounds reminiscent of distress without being identifiably human. Most significantly, tactile sensations joined the auditory phenomena. Something brushed against my shoulder with sufficient pressure to create physical displacement of my clothing. Similar contact occurred against my lower back and the posterior aspect of my right leg in rapid succession. Each contact point experienced a localized temperature drop that persisted for several seconds after the initial sensation. These physical contacts occurred simultaneously with the most proximate auditory events, creating a multisensory experience that severely tested my psychological resilience. The absence of visual confirmation for these physical interactions created a cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm rational thought processes. I increased my pace to maximum sustainable speed, prioritizing directional accuracy while accepting increased risk of environmental hazards, such as unseen obstacles or terrain irregularities. The calculated risk assessment indicated that expedition from this environment outweighed standard safety protocols for wilderness navigation. As I approached the estimated boundary between pine forest and normal woodland, the combined phenomena reached peak intensity. The soundscape transformed into a continuous overlapping pattern of voices and non-vocal sounds that approached overwhelming volume. Physical contacts occurred at intervals of approximately 3 seconds, creating an almost continuous sensation of being handled by multiple entities simultaneously. The environmental lighting reached minimum visibility thresholds, despite the mid-afternoon hour. Temperature decreased to a level that produced visible vapor with each exhalation. Most concerning, the visually perceptible path ahead appeared to shift and reconfigure in ways that contradicted physical possibility, suggesting either environmental manipulation or significant perceptual distortion. The precise moment of transition between pine forest and normal woodland occurred with unexpected abruptness. One step brought me from conditions of near darkness, substantial cold, and continuous multisensory phenomena into standard forest conditions, normal lighting, seasonal temperature, and complete cessation of unexplained events. The transition created a sensory shock that momentarily disrupted cognitive processing. The sudden absence of stimuli that had reached overwhelming intensity created a vacuum-like experience where normal environmental conditions temporarily registered as insufficient or incomplete. Maintained forward movement while conducting rapid self-assessment for physical injuries or physiological abnormalities. Despite the tactile sensations experienced within the pine forest, no evidence of physical contact remained. No marks on skin, no damage to clothing, no residual materials transferred from another entity. Body temperature normalized rapidly despite the extreme cold experienced moments before. Cognitive function stabilized within approximately 90 seconds of crossing this threshold. I conducted comprehensive environmental assessment to confirm return to standard woodland conditions and verify directional accuracy toward my entry point. All measurements indicated normal conditions consistent with typical regional forest environments, with no evidence of the anomalies experienced within the pine stand. Once basic safety parameters were established, I documented key observations through detailed voice recordings, including timestamps, geographic coordinates, and sequential reconstruction of events while memory remained fresh. This documentation process served dual purposes of creating a reliable record and reestablishing normal cognitive patterns through structured analytical activity. Despite rational assessment indicating complete cessation of anomalous phenomena, I maintained elevated vigilance throughout the remainder of the extraction route. The abrupt transition between conditions raised significant questions regarding the boundary stability and the potential for phenomena to extend beyond the visually distinctive pine forest. The remaining journey to my original entry point proceeded without further incident. Standard forest conditions prevailed throughout, with expected wildlife activity, normal acoustic properties, and consistent environmental parameters. The familiar landmarks previously noted during initial approach appeared in expected sequence and condition, confirming reliable navigation. Upon reaching my transportation, a dual-sport motorcycle suitable for both paved roads and reasonable off-road conditions, I conducted thorough equipment assessment before departure. All items remained in original condition without unexplained alterations or damages. The vehicle started without difficulty and performed according to specifications. The return journey to my residence provided essential decompression time, while maintaining necessary focus on operational safety. I deliberately engaged analytical thought processes, reviewing events in sequential order and categorizing phenomena according to sensory channels, intensity progression, and spatial relationships. This preliminary analysis yielded concerning patterns. The phenomena demonstrated apparent intelligence through strategic positioning, escalation relative to my responses, and coordinated sensory elements. More significantly, the events exhibited knowledge of effective human psychological pressure points, exploiting established fear responses to absence of visual confirmation, strategic use of child distress signals, and calculated escalation patterns that maximized disorientation. Upon reaching my residence, I implemented standard security protocols while conducting a thorough review of documentation collected during the event. I transferred voice recordings to redundant storage, created written transcriptions, and developed preliminary event mapping that correlated phenomena with geographic positions. Despite extensive analysis, rational explanations remained elusive. Environmental factors such as gas pockets, infrasound, or unusual electromagnetic fields could potentially explain isolated elements, but failed to account for the integrated, apparently responsive nature of the complete experience. Psychological factors including situational stress responses, pareidolia, or sensory processing anomalies offered partial explanations, but could not reasonably account for the consistent patterns and multisensory integration observed. In the days following this incident, I conducted extensive research regarding both the specific geographic location and similar reported phenomena. Local historical records indicated no specific anomalies associated with the area, though I noted the relative absence of development or regular human activity in that precise location, despite surrounding land being utilized for various purposes. Environmental analysis using publicly available data showed no obvious geographical, geological, or ecological factors that would explain the distinctive pine monoculture or the phenomena experienced within it. Regional folklore contained limited references to areas of forest considered unwelcoming or disorienting, but nothing that aligned precisely with my experience or location. Scientific literature offered various potential explanations for isolated elements of my experience. Infrasound at specific frequencies can produce anxiety, disorientation, and sensations of presence. Certain environmental toxins, particularly fungal spores present in forest environments, can induce temporary perceptual alterations. Geomagnetic anomalies can affect brain function in ways that produce sensory disturbances. However, these potential explanations failed to account for the apparent intelligence behind the phenomena, the strategic positioning, the escalation patterns correlated with my responses, and the integrated multisensory nature of the experience. These aspects suggested either an unidentified natural phenomenon of extraordinary complexity or intentional agency behind the events. The implications of this experience extend beyond personal curiosity into domains of scientific significance. If the phenomena resulted from natural causes, they represent potentially undocumented interactions between environmental factors and human perception that merit formal investigation. If some form of intelligent agency was involved, the implications become considerably more profound. I have not returned to the location since this incident. While scientific curiosity suggests value in further investigation, risk assessment indicates that additional exposure without comprehensive monitoring equipment and personnel support would constitute an unacceptable safety hazard. Furthermore, the psychological impact of the experience, while manageable through rational analysis, created a residual caution that influences decision-making regarding this specific location. I present this account not as evidence of supernatural occurrence but as documentation of unexplained phenomena that challenge conventional explanations. My experience in the pine forest represents one of many anomalous events that exist at the boundaries of current understanding, neither conclusively natural nor definitively supernatural, but residing in the uncertainty space that drives scientific inquiry forward. Whatever created these experiences, whether environmental factors, psychological responses, or something beyond current classification, the pine forest remains a location where expected physical rules appeared suspended, and where something demonstrated awareness of human presence in ways that defy simple explanation. I grew up with acres upon acres of woods behind my house in southeastern Pennsylvania, specifically Westbrook County. The landscape was a patchwork of farmland and forest, a place where suburban comfort gradually gave way to rural stillness. A local farmer owned most of the woodland, but nobody minded the neighborhood children exploring the area. Vast fields flanked both sides of the woods, and the farmer had once carved narrow trails through the trees to move cattle between pastures. Those woods were our kingdom. My brother, sister, and I claimed them as our playground, our refuge from the structured world of school and chores. We knew every fallen log, every fork in the path, every seasonal change that transformed our forest sanctuary. A shallow creek cut through the property, offering endless possibilities: fishing in spring, swimming in summer, and what we called mucklucking in the muddier months, wading through silt to catch frogs and salamanders with our bare hands. We ventured there in all seasons, all weather conditions. Snow-covered branches in winter became our architectural challenges. Rain-soaked paths in autumn turned into natural obstacle courses. Sun-dappled clearings in summer served as our meeting spots. I even hiked those woods on moonlit nights as a child, finding the familiar terrain transformed into something more magical but never threatening. The silver light filtering through leaves created patterns I could navigate blindfolded if needed. The wildlife was typical for the region: foxes trotting through underbrush, raccoons washing food in the creek, deer bounding away at our approach, and squirrels chattering warnings from above. Nothing dangerous lurked there, at least not back then. This was 2018, before coyotes had reclaimed the territory, before I understood that not all wilderness welcomes human visitors. I was 11 years old when everything changed. The incident that transformed my relationship with those woods happened on what began as an ordinary autumn day. Looking back now, I recognize the subtle warning signs we ignored, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath as we entered. But at 11, I hadn't yet learned to read those signals. Mia had been my best friend since 3rd grade. She lived just 2 houses down, and we shared an adventurous spirit that often led us beyond the neighborhood boundaries. That Saturday in October 2018 dawned crisp and clear, perfect for exploration. We packed simple lunches, filled our water bottles, and set out before our parents could assign weekend chores. "Let's go all the way to Vine Hill today," I suggested, referring to our nickname for the elevated clearing where massive grapevines had grown thick enough to support our weight. We'd fashioned crude swings there, testing their strength cautiously before trusting them completely. Mia agreed enthusiastically. "Race you to the creek crossing," she called, already sprinting ahead. We hiked for most of the morning following the main trail before branching off onto less defined paths that wound upward through increasingly dense vegetation. Conversation flowed easily between us. School drama, family annoyances, dreams of future adventures beyond our small town. The sunlight streamed through the canopy, creating dappled patterns that shifted with each breath of wind. By midday, we'd reached Vine Hill. The clearing offered a panoramic view of the valley below, trees stretching in every direction like a rumpled green blanket. The massive vines hung from sturdy oak branches, their woody tendrils thicker than my wrist. We took turns swinging out over the sloping hillside, the momentary weightlessness bringing shrieks of delight. After eating our sandwiches and apples, we sprawled in the patchy grass, cloud-watching and plotting the rest of our day. The sky remained perfectly clear, an endless expanse of October blue that promised hours more daylight for exploration. "We should head back along the ridge trail," I said eventually, brushing crumbs from my jeans. "It's longer, but there's that weird rock formation I wanted to show you." Mia checked her watch, a birthday gift she rarely removed. "We've got time," she agreed. "Mom doesn't expect me until dinner." We gathered our belongings and started down the hill toward the woods. The moment we stepped beneath the tree line, something subtle shifted. The temperature dropped several degrees, not unusual in the shade, but this felt different, more immediate, as though we'd crossed an invisible threshold into cooler air. More noticeably, clouds began gathering overhead, their edges visible through gaps in the foliage. "Weather's changing," Mia observed, zipping up her jacket. I nodded, suddenly uneasy without understanding why. Forecast said clear all day. We continued down the trail, our earlier carefree mood gradually replaced by a focused silence. The forest had grown quieter, too. No birds called. No squirrels rustled through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving the woods in an unnatural hush that pressed against my eardrums. The path narrowed as we descended, forcing us to walk single file through thicker undergrowth. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, creating a satisfying crunch with each step. I walked ahead, occasionally holding branches aside for Mia. The rhythmic sound of our footsteps, crunch, 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 became almost hypnotic, until I realized there was an echo. I stopped abruptly, causing Mia to bump into me from behind. "What's wrong?" she whispered, immediately matching my tension. "Listen," I said, remaining perfectly still. We both held our breath. For 5 seconds, nothing. Then a soft shuffling of leaves about 20 yards behind us, slightly uphill from where we stood. "Something's following us," I said, keeping my voice low. Mia shook her head. "Probably just a deer. They're everywhere this time of year." To demonstrate my point, I deliberately took 2 loud steps forward, dragging my feet through the leaves. We waited and seconds later heard an unmistakable mirroring of the sound. Something dragging through the forest floor, matching my movement precisely. "See? I'm not copying you," Mia said, taking her own step forward. After her movement, we both heard it again, leaves shifting behind us, up the hill. We turned simultaneously, scanning the woods for the source. The forest seemed to darken as we watched, clouds now completely obscuring the sun. What had been merely cool air now felt genuinely cold. My breath formed small clouds in front of my face. "Do you see anything?" Mia whispered. I squinted, trying to make sense of the patterns of light and shadow between the trees. Something moved, or seemed to move, roughly 30 feet away. It wasn't the distinct outline of a deer or fox, but something larger and less defined. Then came the sound that transformed our unease into genuine fear, a deep rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. It wasn't the quick, nervous growl of a fox or the warning bark of a deer. This was something primal, something that didn't belong in these familiar woods. Mia's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. Her nails dug into my skin through my jacket sleeve. "What was that?" Her voice had risen an octave. "Don't run," I managed to say, remembering warnings about predators and prey responses. "Back away slowly." We began retreating down the path, eyes fixed on the spot where we'd detected movement. The leaves there shifted again, parting as though something substantial was moving through them, but we couldn't see any animal, any form that made sense, just disturbance without visible cause. With every backward step we took, the unseen entity seemed to advance, maintaining the same distance between us. The growl came again, louder this time, a sound that seemed to reverberate inside my chest cavity. It was a sound that didn't belong in these woods, didn't belong anywhere in this region. "Do you see it?" I hissed, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. "I see the leaves moving," Mia responded, her voice trembling. "But there's nothing there. It's just empty space." She was right. Whatever force pushed through the forest debris left no visible outline, no shape we could identify. Just evidence of passage. Branches swaying, leaves parting, undergrowth compressing, as though something substantial but invisible was stalking us. The rational part of my brain tried to understand. A trick of light, a deceptive wind pattern, perhaps an animal with coloration that blended perfectly with the forest background. But none of these explanations accounted for the growl, which came a third time, closer, deeper, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. All pretense of calm evaporated. "Run!" I shouted, yanking Mia's arm as I spun around. We bolted down the trail, abandoning all caution. Behind us, the sound of pursuit was immediate. A heavy crashing through undergrowth, much faster than our earlier stalker had moved. Whatever had been pacing us was now chasing us and gaining ground rapidly. Terror propelled us forward with reckless speed. Branches whipped our faces as we abandoned the trail for a more direct route toward home. My lungs burned and my legs pumped mechanically. I couldn't risk looking back, couldn't spare the fraction of a second it might cost. Mia ran just behind me, her breathing ragged and punctuated by small, involuntary sounds of fear. The woods I'd known my entire life suddenly seemed alien and malevolent, full of hidden pitfalls and grasping branches that tore at our clothes and skin. The sounds of pursuit continued, crashing vegetation, the occasional low growl, the sense of something massive displacing air behind us. The distance between us and our pursuer seemed to fluctuate. Sometimes it sounded yards away. Other moments it seemed almost at our heels. "I can't," Mia gasped, stumbling on a protruding root. I grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Don't stop!" We burst through a particularly dense section of underbrush and faced a steep embankment leading down to the creek. Under normal circumstances, we would have found another crossing point, but fear eliminated caution. I half slid, half fell down the slope, dragging Mia with me. Cold water soaked through my sneakers as we splashed across the shallow stream, scrambling up the opposite bank on all fours. The sounds of pursuit stopped at the creek's edge. Through the trees, I could make out the disturbance in the vegetation on the far bank, leaves and branches moving as though buffeted by a localized wind. But nothing visible crossed the water. "It stopped," Mia panted, doubled over with her hands on her knees. "Keep moving," I insisted, tugging her sleeve. "We're still too far from home." We maintained a jog for the next quarter mile, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The woods had fallen silent again, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just our labored breathing and footsteps on the forest floor. When we finally spotted the edge of the tree line where the woods met my backyard, relief flooded through me. Sunlight still bathed the open yard, contrasting sharply with the gloom beneath the canopy. Just 50 more yards to safety. Mia stumbled again as we approached the forest boundary, her foot catching in a tangle of exposed roots. She went down hard, crying out in pain and surprise. I turned back, grabbing her arm and hauling her upright with strength I didn't know I possessed. "Go, go, go!" I urged, practically dragging her the final distance. We burst from the tree line into the sunshine of the open yard, not stopping until we reached the back porch. Only then did we turn to look at the woods we'd fled. The trees stood silent and still, no sign of movement or disturbance. No evidence of the terror that had pursued us. "What was that?" Mia whispered, her face pale beneath smears of dirt and scratches. I shook my head, unable to form words around the fear still constricting my throat. We stood watching for several minutes, but nothing emerged from the tree line. Eventually, we retreated inside my house, locking the door behind us. For weeks afterward, neither Mia nor I ventured more than a few feet into the woods. Something fundamental had changed in our relationship with that once familiar place. We told our parents we'd been frightened by a large animal, possibly a feral dog, an explanation that satisfied the adults but fell woefully short of capturing what we'd experienced. When we did approach the forest edge, that sensation of being watched would immediately descend, raising goosebumps on our arms even on warm days. We'd feel eyes on us from the shadows between trees, though we never saw anything concrete. Might have eventually convinced myself it had been nothing more than overactive imagination, two children scaring themselves with shadow play and forest sounds, if not for what happened to my brother the following month. Blake was 16 and considerably less impressionable than I was. He spent most weekends riding his quad through the more remote sections of the woods, often with his friend Jason. Their excursions frequently took them deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured, along old logging roads and game trails that extended for miles beyond our property. One Sunday in late November, they set out in the early afternoon with fishing gear strapped to their vehicles. Their destination was a deep pool beneath a small waterfall, about 3 miles from our house in the opposite direction from where Mia and I had experienced our terrifying encounter. Blake returned alone just before dusk, his face ashen and his quad splattered with mud from reckless driving. Jason arrived separately 20 minutes later, equally shaken. They'd abandoned all their fishing gear worth hundreds of dollars beside the creek. My parents were furious until they realized something was genuinely wrong. Blake wasn't typically prone to dramatics, yet he refused to explain what had happened until Jason had gone home. Later that night, I overheard him talking with our father in the kitchen. "It wasn't an animal, Dad. Not like anything I've ever seen around here." Blake's voice carried the same tremor I recognized from my own experience. "We were just setting up our gear when the weather changed. Got dark and cold super fast, like someone flipped a switch." "November weather can turn quickly," our father said reasonably. "This wasn't normal," Blake insisted. 1 minute, perfect clear skies. Next minute, freezing cold and dark. Then we heard something coming down the trail from the north side. I moved closer to the doorway, careful to remain out of sight. "At first, we thought it was someone on horseback," Blake continued. "The sound was rhythmic, heavy. I called out, thinking it might be Mr. Winters checking his property line." "And?" my father prompted when Blake fell silent. "The sound that came back wasn't human, Dad. It wasn't anything that belongs in those woods. This deep growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once." I felt a chill of recognition. Blake hadn't known about my experience. I hadn't told anyone in the family, afraid they'd dismiss it as childish imagination. "Jason saw it first," Blake said, his voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear. Or rather, he saw the disturbance, like heat waves above hot pavement but moving between the trees, pushing branches aside, coming right toward us. "Blake, son, there has to be a logical—" "We left everything and ran for the quads," Blake interrupted. "I've never seen Jason so scared. He's on the wrestling team, for God's sake." We fired up the engines and took off, and the whole time I swear something was right behind us, keeping pace even at 30 miles per hour through dense woods. It stopped following only when we crossed Mill Creek Bridge. There was a long silence before our father spoke again. "Look, I'm not saying I don't believe you experienced something frightening, but there's always an explanation that doesn't involve—" He trailed off. "Doesn't involve what, Dad?" "I'm not saying it was a ghost or monster. I'm saying there's something in those woods that I can't explain, and it scared the hell out of me, and I'm not going back there alone." In the weeks that followed, I began researching local history, looking for anything that might explain what both my brother and I had encountered. The county library yielded old newspapers on microfiche, local history books, and collections of regional folklore. I learned that before European settlers arrived, the Lenape people had considered portions of the region sacred, or perhaps forbidden. Early colonial records mentioned areas where the indigenous guides refused to hunt or establish trails. One journal entry from a settler in 1753 described an incident where their hunting party became separated in dense woods. The lost member was found 2 days later, feverish and incoherent, claiming he'd been stalked by something that moved through the forest without disturbing branches, yet left heavy footprints in soft ground. More recent history proved equally unsettling. In 1967, a university research team conducting a wildlife survey reported equipment failures and inexplicable data readings in specific sections of the forest, the same general area where both encounters had occurred. Their report mentioned anomalous electromagnetic disturbances and unexplained thermal signatures before the study was abruptly discontinued. Most disturbing were the occasional reports of hikers and campers who had experienced similar phenomena over decades, sudden weather changes, the sensation of being followed, unexplained sounds, and the recurring description of displacement without visible cause. Some described it as looking at nothing, but knowing something substantial is there. None of these accounts offered explanations, only confirmation that whatever lurked in those woods had been there long before my family moved to the property and would likely remain long after we departed. Winter arrived with heavy snow that transformed the forest into a monochromatic landscape of white and gray. The thick blanket seemed to pacify the woods, rendering them serene and less threatening. By January, the memory of our encounters had faded enough that Blake occasionally ventured out on his quad again, though never to the waterfall pool and never alone. I maintained my distance until March, when the first hints of spring began to emerge. Cabin fever and natural curiosity gradually overcame lingering fear. One Saturday morning, I stood at the edge of the tree line, watching as melting snow dripped from branches and early wildflowers pushed through the forest floor. Mia had moved away in December, her father's job transfer taking their family to Colorado. Without my exploration partner, I felt oddly untethered, missing our adventures despite the terror of our last outing. Perhaps that loneliness contributed to my decision to re-enter the woods alone. I chose a bright morning, telling my mother I'd remain within shouting distance of the house. The forest felt welcoming again, birds calling, squirrels chattering, sunlight streaming through branches just beginning to bud. I followed our most familiar path, the one leading to the creek crossing. Everything remained normal until I reached the water's edge. There, something shifted in the atmosphere. Not dramatically as before, but subtly. The bird sounds diminished. The air grew still. That familiar sensation of being observed returned, raising the fine hairs on my arms. Across the creek, partially obscured by a stand of young trees, I noticed something unusual. At first, I thought it might be a deer standing motionless watching me, but as I focused, I realized I wasn't seeing an animal at all, but rather an absence. A deer-sized distortion in the visual field, like looking through uneven glass. The water between us seemed to serve as a boundary. Whatever waited on the far bank made no move to cross, no sound to threaten. We simply observed each other across the dividing line of the creek. Minutes passed in this silent standoff before I slowly, deliberately turned and walked back toward home. No pursuit followed. No growl echoed through the trees. Just the prickling awareness of being watched until I cleared the woodland boundary. 7 years have passed since those encounters in 2018. I've returned to the woods countless times since then, having developed a complex relationship with the forest and whatever inhabits its deeper regions. What began as terror gradually transformed into cautious respect, an acknowledgement of boundaries and territories. I never again experienced anything as frightening as that first encounter with Mia. But occasionally, when venturing beyond certain invisible thresholds, I'll notice the telltale signs: sudden temperature drops, unnatural silence, that unmistakable sensation of being monitored by something just beyond normal perception. Blake eventually told me about subsequent encounters during his quad excursions, moments when he'd round a bend and find the path ahead distorted by that same visual anomaly, forcing him to find alternate routes. We compared notes, mapped locations, and gradually identified patterns. The entity, or entities, seemed to concentrate in 3 distinct areas of the forest, with the creek serving as a consistent boundary. Our family still owns the property. I'm in college now, studying ecology with a focus on conservation biology. My experiences have shaped my academic interests, driving me to understand the complex relationships between environments and their inhabitants, seen and unseen. When I return home during breaks, I still walk those familiar paths. I have developed rituals of my own, small gestures of acknowledgement when crossing certain thresholds, careful attention to subtle warnings in the forest atmosphere. I never venture into the woods after sudden weather changes. I never cross the creek during the darker half of the year. The rational part of my mind has constructed various explanations over the years: unusual atmospheric conditions creating mirages, undocumented predators with exceptional camouflage abilities, even the possibility of hallucinations triggered by environmental factors like fungal spores or natural gas emissions. But beneath these scientific hypotheses lies a deeper understanding. Some places contain mysteries that resist categorization. The woods behind my childhood home harbor something ancient and aware, something that established its territory long before human settlement and merely tolerates our presence under certain conditions. I no longer fear it as I once did. Instead, I've learned to coexist with the knowledge that not everything in our world fits neatly into biological classifications or scientific explanations. The forest has taught me humility and boundary respect, lessons that extend far beyond those acres of trees into every aspect of my life. Sometimes, standing at that creek crossing on bright summer days, I sense acknowledgement from the other side. Not friendship, not acceptance, but recognition. Two different forms of awareness sharing overlapping territory, establishing wary protocols for coexistence. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all we can ask from the ancient, unknowable things that were here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. I've always been interested in the unexplained. Even as a child, I collected books about strange occurrences, watched documentaries about mysterious events, and listened to podcasts about unsettling incidents that defied rational explanation. I believed I understood fear, the theoretical concept of it at least. But nothing prepared me for what happened during that weekend in October 2018. My name is Damos, a Lithuanian name given to me by my grandparents who immigrated to America decades before I was born. I was 11 years old when the incident occurred, a skinny kid standing at just about 5 feet tall and weighing only 36 kilograms. My mother, a nurse working rotating shifts at the regional hospital, often left me with my grandparents when she had to work overnight. Their house sat on the edge of town, bordered by dense woods on one side and open farmland on the other. It was a place I normally loved visiting, until that night. My grandparents had a dinner reservation at their favorite restaurant, followed by a community event they'd been looking forward to for weeks. They weren't expected back until after 9 p.m. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I enjoyed the independence. The old Victorian house with its creaking floorboards and drafty corridors had always felt like a second home to me. "We'll be back around 9:30, my grandmother had said, adjusting her pearl necklace as she stood by the door. "There's leftover stew in the refrigerator. Just heat it up when you get hungry." My grandfather had added, "Remember, keep the doors locked. Call us if you need anything." I nodded, barely looking up from my phone. "I'll be fine. I have homework anyway." After they left, I locked the door behind them and went upstairs to the guest bedroom where I always stayed. The room had an old desk positioned beneath a large window that overlooked the backyard. I set up my laptop, opened my textbooks, and began working on my math assignment. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of old pipes and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, twilight gradually surrendered to darkness. I worked steadily, occasionally glancing at the time. By 8 p.m. I had finished most of my homework and decided to take a break. That's when everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came as a subtle disruption. I was heading downstairs to get something to drink when I heard an unusual sound, footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway outside. They were slow, deliberate, with uneven pauses between them. I froze on the middle step of the staircase, one hand on the wooden banister. The sound wasn't the quick, purposeful stride of someone walking to the front door. Rather, it seemed exploratory, as if someone was carefully examining the perimeter of the house. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and weak against the pressing silence. No response came. Logic offered several innocent explanations. A neighbor's pet wandering onto the property, wildlife from the nearby woods, or perhaps just the settling of the house distorted by my overactive imagination. I had, after all, spent the previous night watching horror stories on YouTube, a habit my mother constantly criticized. "You fill your head with that nonsense, and then you wonder why you're jumping at shadows," she would say. Standing there in the dim stairwell, I tried to convince myself that my mother was right. I was letting my imagination run wild. Taking a deep breath, I continued down to the kitchen. The large windows in the kitchen offered a clear view of the side yard and part of the driveway. I carefully approached, staying close to the wall, and peered out. The security light illuminated most of the area, casting long shadows from the trees and bushes. Nothing seemed out of place. As I reached for a glass from the cabinet, I noticed something unusual. The security light flickered, dimmed for a moment, then brightened again. In that brief instant of darkness, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the yard, a shifting of shadows that didn't align with the wind-blown branches. My hand trembled slightly as I filled my glass with water. The house felt different now. The familiar corners seemed to hide unseen threats, and the comforting silence had transformed into a tense anticipation. I gulped down the water and quickly headed back upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. Back in my room, I tried to focus on homework again, but concentration eluded me. Every creak and groan of the old house now demanded my attention. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. After 20 minutes of failed attempts to focus, I decided to call my grandparents. I reached for my phone but hesitated. What would I tell them? That I was scared of footsteps I might have imagined? That shadows were moving strangely? They would either worry unnecessarily or more likely think I was being childish. I put the phone down and turned back to my homework, determined to push through my uneasiness. That's when I noticed the window. The large bedroom window had always given me a sense of openness, connecting the cozy interior with the expansive outdoors. Now it felt like a vulnerability, a transparent barrier too easily breached. Outside, the night had fully settled in, transforming the glass into a dark mirror that reflected the dimly lit room. As I stared at my own reflection, something moved outside. At first, it was just a vague disturbance in the darkness, like a denser patch of night shifting against the background. I blinked, convinced it was an optical illusion. It wasn't. What I saw next made my heart hammer against my ribs. Standing in the yard, partially illuminated by the distant security light, was a figure. It was unnaturally tall, towering at what must have been at least 12 feet. The proportions were wrong, too elongated, too thin to be human. Its form was pitch black, absorbing rather than reflecting the meager light. I stared, frozen in place, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure remained motionless, seemingly looking directly at my window. A distant part of my mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was just the shadow of a tree cast by passing car headlights, or some kind of optical illusion created by the yard lights and moving branches. But then it moved. The movement was unnatural, not the fluid motion of a living thing, but a jerky, disjointed shift that reminded me of stop-motion animation. The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if studying me through the window. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I simply sat there, a small, terrified 11-year-old boy witnessing something my mind couldn't process. Time stretched painfully. What was probably only a minute felt like an endless hour of terror. Then, with a motion too quick to follow, the figure dropped down and vanished from my line of sight. I heard a soft thud from the yard below, as if something heavy had landed on the ground. The spell of paralysis broke. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair in the process. My breathing came in short, panicked gasps as I backed against the far wall, keeping my eyes fixed on the window. Nothing appeared. The yard outside remained still and empty. After several minutes of heart-pounding tension, I gathered my courage and slowly approached the window again. Pressing my face against the glass, I peered down into the yard. The security light cast long shadows across the lawn, but nothing unusual moved there. Whatever I had seen or thought I had seen was gone. I was about to turn away when a sound from downstairs made me freeze again. Deimos? The voice drifted up from the ground floor, a familiar, comforting voice with a distinctive Lithuanian accent. Deimos, are you up there? We forgot our key. Can you open the door for us? It was my grandfather's voice. Relief flooded through me, so powerful that my knees nearly buckled. My grandparents were home early. Whatever strange thing I thought I'd seen was forgotten in the rush of comfort their return brought. I was halfway to the bedroom. Daughter, when realization stopped me cold, my grandparents wouldn't be back until after 9 p.m. A quick glance at my phone showed it was only 8:15, and they wouldn't have forgotten their key. My grandmother was meticulously organized about such things, always checking her purse before leaving the house. Most importantly, I distinctly remembered watching my grandfather lock the door from the inside before they left, using the deadbolt that required a key from either side. He had then pocketed the key. Deimos? The voice called again, slightly more insistent. Please come down. We need to get inside. The voice was perfect, the exact timbre and accent of my grandfather, but something about it raised the hairs on the back of my neck. It was too perfect, like a recording played back rather than a natural voice with the tiny imperfections of human speech. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, heart pounding. Deimos, we know you're there. Come downstairs now. The voice had changed subtly, still recognizable as my grandfather, but with an underlying tone I'd never heard from him before, demanding, cold, with a hint of something that didn't sound human at all. I backed away from the door, moving as quietly as possible. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Either someone was impersonating my grandfather with uncanny accuracy, or something was very, very wrong. The voice called once more, dropping all pretense of familiarity. Come down now. The sound that came from downstairs no longer resembled my grandfather. It was deep, guttural, with an odd echo as if multiple voices were speaking simultaneously. The words themselves seemed to vibrate the floorboards beneath my feet. Terror gripped me completely now. Whatever was downstairs was not my grandfather. It wasn't human at all. I needed evidence. I needed help. Most of all, I needed someone to believe me when this was over. My hands shook as I reached for my backpack and pulled out my GoPro camera, a birthday present from my mother who thought it might encourage me to spend more time outdoors rather than on my computer. I had barely used it, but now I was grateful for its presence. Attaching it to the extension pole, I turned it on and made sure it was recording. The small red light blinked reassuringly, a tiny beacon of technology and rationality in a situation that made no sense. From downstairs, silence had fallen. No more calling of my name, no more demands to come down. The absence of sound was somehow more terrifying than the distorted voice had been. With the GoPro extended on its pole, I approached the bedroom door. My original plan was to open it slightly and position the camera to record the hallway and stairs, but as I reached for the doorknob, a new sound froze me in place. Something was coming up the stairs. The steps were slow, deliberate, and wrong. The rhythm irregular, as if the entity climbing them had an unusual gait or too many limbs. Each creak of the old wooden staircase marked its progress toward the second floor. I backed away from the door, GoPro still recording, and looked desperately around the room for an escape route. The window was the only option, but jumping from the second floor risked serious injury. Besides, whatever I had seen outside might still be there. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. Then slowly, they began moving down the hallway toward my room. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but a strange clarity cut through the fear. If this was real, if some unknown entity was actually in my grandparents' house, I needed to document it. Not just for others to believe me, but to confirm to myself later that I hadn't imagined it all. I positioned myself in the corner farthest from the door. GoPro extended in front of me and waited. The footsteps stopped outside my door. The hallway light, which I had left on earlier, suddenly went out, plunging the space beneath the door into darkness. The doorknob began to turn slowly, silently. I held my breath, camera aimed steadily at the door despite my trembling arms. The door opened a crack, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Then gradually it swung wider. The hallway should have been visible, but instead there was only an impenetrable blackness that seemed to absorb the light from my bedroom. Something moved in that darkness. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shifting, a redistribution of the shadows that suggested massive size and unnatural shape. The GoPro's small screen showed only static when pointed at the doorway, as if the technology itself couldn't process what was there. Then a long, impossibly thin appendage extended from the darkness into my room. Not a human arm, but something that resembled a branch or tentacle, matte black and jointed in too many places. It reached directly for the camera. What happened next occurred with terrifying speed. The appendage wrapped around the GoPro and yanked with tremendous force. The extension pole nearly pulled out of my grasp. But pure terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I held on, pulling back with every ounce of my 36-kilogram frame. A strange, high-pitched sound emanated from the darkness, not quite a shriek, not quite static, but something in between that hurt my ears and made my vision blur momentarily. The thing in the doorway pulled harder, dragging me forward across the wooden floor toward the open door. "No," I screamed, bracing my feet against the floor. "Let go." My voice seemed to have an unexpected effect. The pulling stopped for a split second, as if my human voice had startled the entity. In that brief moment of hesitation, I yanked back with all my might, twisting the pole to break its grip. The GoPro came free suddenly, sending me stumbling backward against the desk. The camera was intact, still recording, though the extension pole was deformed where the thing had gripped it, the plastic warped as if exposed to intense heat. In the doorway, the darkness seemed to contract, pulling back from the room. The appendage withdrew, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed something in the hallway, a towering silhouette that defied normal human proportions, its head nearly touching the ceiling, limbs too numerous and too long. Then it was gone. The hallway light flickered back on, revealing nothing but the empty corridor. The normal sounds of the house returned. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the faint whisper of the heating system. I remained pressed against the desk. GoPro clutched to my chest for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Every muscle in my body trembled from adrenaline and exertion. When nothing further happened, I finally gathered the courage to move. Keeping the camera pointed at the doorway, I sidled along the wall until I reached the landline phone on the nightstand. Without taking my eyes off the door, I dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your situation?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and wonderfully normal. "There's someone or something in my grandparents' house," I whispered. "I'm alone and scared. Please send help." I gave the address and answered the dispatcher's questions as best I could, though I avoided describing exactly what I had seen. I knew it would sound crazy, that they might not take me seriously if I mentioned impossible heights and too many limbs. "Stay on the line with me, Damos," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way. They should be there in about 10 minutes. Is there somewhere safe you can hide until they arrive?" I glanced at the closet, then at the still open bedroom door. "I don't think so. It knows where I am. Who knows where you are, Damos? Can you see the intruder?" I swallowed hard. Not anymore. But it was just here. It had tried to take my camera. "Officers are coming." "Damos, just stay calm and stay on the line." I clutched the phone like a lifeline, keeping my eyes fixed on the doorway and the GoPro ready in my other hand. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The high-pitched wail grew gradually louder, announcing the approach of help, of rational adults who would make sense of what had happened. "The police are almost there, Damos," the dispatcher said. "Can you hear the sirens?" "Yes," I whispered, relief making my voice shake. "I can hear them. When they arrive, I want you to stay where you are until the officers call out to you. They'll identify themselves as police. Don't come down until they do, okay?" "Okay." I heard the police cruisers pull into the driveway, car doors slamming, and the crackle of radios. Flashlight beams swept across the yard, visible through my window. The blue and red lights from the police cars created a rhythmic pattern on the bedroom ceiling, strangely comforting in their normality and human origin. "Police. Anyone in the house, identify yourself," a strong male voice called from downstairs. "I'm upstairs," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Second floor, first bedroom on the right." Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, regular human footsteps with the accompanying jangling of equipment. 2 officers appeared in the doorway, flashlights sweeping the room before settling on me, huddled in the corner with the phone and camera. "Are you Damos?" one of the officers asked, holstering his weapon. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The officers conducted a thorough search of the house, room by room, closet by closet. They found no signs of an intruder, no evidence of forced entry. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside, just as my grandparents had left them. "Did you see who was in the house?" the first officer asked me once they had concluded their search. "Not clearly," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. It was dark, but I got some of it on my camera. I handed over the GoPro and the officer rewound the footage to view it on the small screen. His expression remained neutral as he watched, but I could tell something was wrong by the way his eyebrows drew together. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the screen toward me. "The footage is corrupted. There's just static during the time you said the intruder was here." I stared at the screen in disbelief. The video showed me setting up the camera, pointing it at the door, and then nothing but snow and distortion until several minutes later, when it cleared to show me on the phone with the dispatcher. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I recorded it." I saw it on the screen. The officer gave me a sympathetic look. "Technology isn't always reliable, son, especially in high-stress situations." Despite the lack of evidence, the officers took my statement seriously. One of them stayed with me while the other continued to patrol the property. They called my grandparents, who immediately left their event to rush home. By the time my grandparents arrived, pale-faced and worried, I had calmed down enough to tell a more rational version of events. I described hearing unusual noises and seeing a shadow outside that frightened me. I mentioned the voice that sounded like my grandfather, but avoided describing the impossible height or the strange appendage that had grabbed my camera. The police conducted a final sweep of the property before leaving, promising to patrol the area throughout the night. The officer who had viewed my footage gave me his card. "If you remember anything else or notice anything unusual, call me directly," he said quietly, when my grandparents weren't listening. There was something in his eyes, not quite belief, but not dismissal either. He had seen something in that corrupted footage, something he wasn't acknowledging officially. The weeks following the incident passed in a blur of nightmares and whispered conversations. My grandparents, though they never said they believed my full account, were deeply disturbed by what had happened. They installed additional security lights, upgraded the locks, and never again left me alone in the house. But the measures weren't enough. Within 3 months, they had put the house on the market. When no buyers showed interest, they simply moved out, relocating to a modern apartment closer to town. The old Victorian house stands empty now, gradually deteriorating as seasons pass. Sometimes I drive by with my mother now that I'm older. The sight of the boarded-up windows and overgrown yard fills me with a complicated mix of emotions. Nostalgia for the happy times spent there before that night, and a persistent dread that has never fully dissipated. I still have the GoPro, though I rarely use it. The footage from that night remains on the memory card, unwatched for years. The extension pole still bears the strange deformations where something gripped it, the only physical evidence that what happened was real. The police officer who gave me his card called once, about a week after the incident. He asked strange questions about the house's history, about whether my grandparents had experienced anything unusual during their years there. When I asked if he had found something in the corrupted footage, he hesitated before answering. "There was something," he said finally. "Probably just digital artifacts, distortion from the camera's processor. But it looked..." He never finished the sentence. I've researched extensively since then, trying to find rational explanations for what I experienced. The human mind is extraordinarily good at creating patterns from random stimuli, at transforming shadows into threats when primed by fear. Perhaps that's all it was. An 11-year-old boy with an imagination overstimulated by horror stories, alone in an old house full of normal creaks and shadows. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the house settles around me, I remember the perfect imitation of my grandfather's voice calling my name, and the impossible silhouette in the hallway. I remember the strength with which it pulled on the camera, and the way the footage corrupted precisely during the encounter. The old Victorian house remains empty. No one has lived there since my grandparents moved out. Local teenagers occasionally dare each other to approach it at night, but none have ever broken in. Something about the place repels even the most courageous thrill-seekers. I drive by sometimes, always in daylight. From the safety of my car, I study the darkened windows and wonder what might still reside within those walls. I wonder if it's confined to that location, or if, someday, I might hear that perfect imitation of a loved one's voice calling my name from the shadows. Still don't know what I encountered that night, whether it was something supernatural or simply the product of an overactive imagination, combined with ordinary but misinterpreted events. What I do know is that true fear isn't about jump scares or gore. It's about the moment when reality shifts slightly. When something impossible intrudes into the normal world, and you realize how fragile our understanding of existence truly is. That's the kind of fear that never really leaves you. It just waits, patient as the darkness for moments when your guard is down.